Have you ever felt like you're living someone else's life? Like you're a character in an absurd play, but no one ever gave you the script. Every day you're thrown into a pointless routine, answering to an invisible authority and desperately searching for logic where there is none. That's not just stress. It's a deep-seated anxiety that Franz Kafka described with chilling accuracy a century ago. He exposed the mechanisms that turn us into helpless cogs in a soulless machine, whether it's our jobs, our society, or even our own families. But what if his bleak writings hold not just a diagnosis, but also a path to freedom? In this video, we'll dive into Kafka's world to understand why his reality has become our own. Watch until the end to discover who's really pulling the strings in your life and whether those strings can be cut. So get comfortable. Don't forget to subscribe, because this video is the most complete breakdown of Franz Kafka's philosophy you'll find. Part 1, Justice versus Law. At the heart of the trial, as well as much of Kafka's other writing, lies a deep and troubling conflict, the gap between the ideal of justice and the practical machinery of law. Kafka carefully delineates these two concepts, which are often wrongly treated as interchangeable. Justice reflects a timeless human yearning for truth, fairness, and moral integrity. In contrast, law is the structured attempt by society to organize and enforce those ideals through formal institutions. The tragedy, as Kafka portrays it, is that these noble intentions inevitably become distorted when translated into the rigid mechanisms of bureaucratic systems. What begins as the pursuit of a higher moral order becomes entangled in procedures and technicalities that strip it of its essence. The drive to institutionalize justice, to give it form and power, ironically results in legal systems that often undermine the very values they were intended to uphold. Kafka's critique does not hinge on flawed execution within particular systems. Rather, he challenges the entire premise of trying to embody perfect justice through fallible human institutions. Institutions, by their nature, demand order, efficiency, and uniformity, values that frequently clash with the subtle, individualized discernment that true justice requires. In the trial, Joseph K. is subjected to treatment that stands in stark opposition to the basic tenets of a just legal process. He is never told what he is accused of, denied critical information about his case, obstructed from accessing competent legal counsel, and ultimately executed, all without ever comprehending the rationale behind his punishment. Nevertheless, the system continually affirms that whatever actions it takes are inherently just. It positions itself as the ultimate authority on justice, thereby rendering its decisions beyond question or scrutiny. This leads to a closed, self-justifying system. Since the legal apparatus defines justice, everything it does is, by definition, correct. Any attempt to challenge, question, or resist its processes is interpreted as a sign of guilt. Any suffering imposed is seen not as a potential miscarriage of justice, but as evidence of the subject's moral failure. Eventually, the boundary between investigation and judgment dissolves. To be scrutinized by the system becomes synonymous with being condemned by it. The system cannot afford to acknowledge the possibility of error, because doing so would call into question its entire claim to embody justice. Kafka's narrative powerfully evokes the despair and disempowerment that arise when individuals are caught in a legal system that is both opaque and unaccountable. Far from protecting the people it claims to serve, the bureaucracy in the trial seems engineered to confound and repress them. It operates under secretive protocols, inaccessible to the public, while those who enforce the rules wield enormous power with little to no responsibility. Procedures proliferate without reason, serving no real purpose beyond reinforcing the dominance of those who administer them. The broader tension between law and justice mirrors the universal conflict between human ideals and lived reality. We dream of flawless fairness, but must accept imperfect versions of it, administered by flawed individuals. We desire rules that apply evenly to all, yet we also want exceptions for unique situations. We aim for consistency, but we also cherish compassion and the chance for personal redemption. These contradictions become especially pressing in modern, pluralistic societies, where legal systems must adjudicate across countless cases involving diverse people with often opposing needs and worldviews. The quest to establish universal laws necessarily involves generalizations, which can result in unfairness to individuals. The demand for speed and organizational ease frequently undermines the slow, reflective processes required for genuine moral evaluation. Efforts to maintain an appearance of impartiality and objectivity may actually strip legal actors of the empathy and human insight that true justice depends upon. Kafka's criticism extends far beyond just legal systems. It targets all forms of institutionalized moral authority. Whether it's religious bodies, schools, corporations, or government agencies, these institutions often present themselves as serving noble ideals. Yet in practice, their actions frequently revolve around protecting and expanding their own influence. They tend to evolve self-serving internal structures that stray from their stated missions or from the actual needs of the people they claim to serve. The drive for institutional survival and expansion can easily overshadow the very values that once justified the institution's creation. However, Kafka does not argue for a world free of institutions or legal systems. Abandoning them does not lead to an idealized form of personal justice. It leads instead to disorder, violence, and the unchecked dominance of the most powerful. Humans require a common set of rules and mechanisms in order to manage conflict and coordinate their actions effectively. The true challenge lies in staying conscious of the discrepancy between institutional processes and authentic justice. Only by recognizing this gap can we attempt to reduce the distortions and corruption that inevitably arise. Meeting this challenge calls for what might be termed institutional humility, an acknowledgement that no human system can fully embody the lofty ideals it professes to uphold. Legal and other institutional frameworks should not be measured by their ability to deliver flawless justice, but rather by whether they surpass the existing alternatives and remain receptive to critique and reform. Trouble begins when institutions start to mistake themselves for the ideals they represent. When they claim to be above error and demand blind loyalty, they shut the door on real justice. If those in power equate the law with justice itself, then true justice is rendered unreachable. The ongoing tension between law and justice raises important questions about how individuals should engage with the institutions that govern their lives. A total rejection of institutional authority risks losing the many benefits that structured cooperation brings. Yet accepting such authority without question makes individuals complicit in the wrongs those systems may commit. What's needed is a balanced stance, one that preserves enough critical distance to recognize the difference between legitimate and illegitimate uses of institutional power, while also striving, from within the system, to advance the cause of true justice wherever possible. Part 2. Religious Themes and Negative Theology. Kafka's work is suffused with religious imagery: guilt, grace, redemption, transcendence, sacrifice, and ultimate power. All themes rooted in spiritual discourse. However, his handling of these motifs is anything but conventional. Kafka doesn't offer religious clarity or comfort. Instead, he engages with these sacred concepts in ways that are often unsettling and subversive. His engagement with religion is marked by tension and complexity, frequently turning toward the bleak and disillusioned. Kafka investigates what becomes of religious awareness when traditional doctrines can no longer be sustained. Rather than soothing his characters, religious themes in his fiction tend to amplify their anxiety, estrangement, and existential despair. Many scholars interpret Kafka's narratives as metaphysical allegories, spiritual journeys aimed toward a divine presence. Yet this divine figure is not one who answers or appears. God in Kafka's world is characterized more by silence than speech, more by absence than presence. His vision aligns with the theological concept of via negativa, or negative theology, which proposes that the divine can only be understood through negation, by identifying what it is not rather than what it is. This perspective cultivates a religious sensibility defined less by belief and assurance than by doubt, yearning, and an unending search. It emphasizes the limits of human understanding, portraying spiritual life not as a path to certainty, but as an encounter with the unknowable. Kafka frames the divine as fundamentally inaccessible, and this very inaccessibility becomes a kind of sacred transcendence. The lack of divine intervention is not a void, but a paradoxical presence. In Kafka's theological imagination, God's silence speaks volumes, and his concealment becomes a profound form of revelation, an expression of the boundaries of human comprehension. Out of this emerges an unusual faith, one sustained not by clarity or conviction, but by the endurance of questions. In Kafka's spiritual world, the inability to connect with God becomes itself a form of religious experience, though it offers no solace or direction for navigating everyday life. Kafka once described writing as a mode of prayer, a way to dissolve the self. For him, the act of writing became a spiritual discipline, not one that illuminated divine truths, but one that deepened mystery. His creative process brought him closer to the sacred, yet always kept it out of reach. In this way, art stands in for religion, becoming both a medium of spiritual expression and a stark reminder of the inadequacy of all human efforts to grasp the transcendent. Literature does not resolve religious doubt, it dramatizes it. Kafka's protagonists, those who strive to do what is right but are endlessly confused, obstructed, and defeated, mirror his own inner conflicts. They reflect a profound spiritual struggle, the experience of individuals who feel deeply bound by moral obligations, even as they lose faith in traditional religious structures. The collapse of organized belief systems does not erase their ethical commitments, but instead leaves them burdened with imperatives they cannot articulate or fulfill. What emerges is a form of secular spirituality, one grounded not in dogma or ritual, but in the ongoing effort to act ethically in a world stripped of divine certainty. Kafka's religious perspective is intricately tied to his identity as a Jew in early 20th century Central Europe. Born into an assimilated, largely secular Jewish family, he inherited only minimal ties to traditional religious practice and communal life. Nevertheless, he remained haunted by the deeper cultural and psychological imprint of Jewish spirituality. This legacy included a profound emphasis on moral responsibility, interpretive engagement with sacred texts, and the fraught dynamic between humanity and divine will. In Kafka's work, we find the condition of those who inherit profound theological questions, but are left without the theological answers that once framed them. Without the guiding voice of a clearly present God, Kafka's characters are left to navigate complex moral terrain on their own. They long to act justly, but they lack a dependable framework for discerning what justice even looks like in their fractured world. Traditional religious institutions have lost the trust and authority they once held, yet no viable secular systems have risen to replace them. As a result, individuals are left to navigate moral decisions entirely on their own, with no overarching spiritual or ethical framework to support or validate their choices. Kafka's works are filled with the motif of sacrifice, but this sacrifice often lacks a clear direction or beneficiary. His characters relinquish their well-being, joy, human connections, and sometimes even their lives, without any indication of what these sacrifices achieve. There is no evident reward, redemption, or purpose. For sacrifice to have meaning, there typically must be clarity about what is being surrendered and for what end. Yet in Kafka's world, people surrender themselves to mysterious, often oppressive forces that remain beyond their understanding. They cannot explain the motivations behind their sacrifices, nor do they grasp the nature of the powers to which they submit. This points to a lingering spiritual instinct, a residual impulse toward self-sacrifice, that survives even in the absence of the religious structures that once gave it significance. In Kafka's universe, the desire for prayer and spiritual connection endures, but such efforts are met with silence or ambiguity. His famous parable Before the Law portrays a man who devotes his entire life to waiting for permission to enter a gate symbolizing the law or divine truth, only to learn in his final moments that the entry was always meant solely for him, and that it is now closing. This allegory suggests that access to the sacred or the transcendent might indeed be possible, but it often escapes our recognition, or it becomes apparent only when it is too late. The tragedy lies not in the absence of the divine, but in our failure to perceive or respond to it when the moment arises. Kafka's engagement with religious ideas ultimately raises a deeper issue. How can one live a meaningful life when the certainties of traditional religion no longer hold? With the collapse of inherited doctrines, institutional guidance, and familiar rituals, we are compelled to cultivate new modes of spiritual awareness. These new approaches might call for a sustained openness to the possibility of transcendence, even while accepting that such experiences will likely remain elusive, undefined, and difficult to interpret. The goal is not to resolve the spiritual dilemma once and for all, but to live sincerely within the paradox, between the yearning for divine meaning and the acceptance of its ongoing mystery. Kafka's recurring religious themes, even in the context of a secular worldview, reveal that the spiritual dimension of human life cannot simply be erased by discarding specific creeds or religious institutions. The existential questions religion seeks to address, concerning purpose, death, morality, and the possibility of the divine, continue to resonate, regardless of whether conventional answers still hold sway. What Kafka offers is a form of negative theology, a way to remain spiritually engaged without pretending to have access to absolute truths. His is a spirituality rooted not in certainty, but in the persistence of inquiry. It is a faith grounded in the act of seeking rather than in arriving, in living the questions more than proclaiming answers. It affirms the value of the spiritual journey, even when the destination remains unknowable. Part 3. Communication and the Collapse of Language. In Kafka's universe, language, meant to be the cornerstone of human connection and mutual understanding, transforms into a mechanism of ongoing confusion and growing alienation. Rather than bridging the gap between individuals, words consistently misfire. Characters find that even their most deliberate expressions are misunderstood, and that their efforts to clarify often deepen the very confusion they seek to resolve. This failure to communicate effectively points to a deeper flaw not in individual speakers, but in language itself, which proves inadequate as a medium for conveying inner life or establishing authentic human bonds. What should function as a bridge instead becomes a wall, reinforcing the profound solitude at the heart of human existence. Kafka's works reveal this dysfunction most clearly in the dialogues between characters who appear to be speaking the same language, yet utterly fail to understand one another. Their conversations are filled with mismatched responses, irrelevant replies, and interpretations that completely miss the intended message. These aren't mere accidents or passing misunderstandings. They represent an entrenched structural problem. The core issue is not incompetence or bad faith on the part of the speakers, but the inherently unstable nature of language itself. Words carry meanings shaped by personal history, culture, and circumstance. As such, perfect understanding becomes a fantasy, even when everyone is trying their best. Kafka recognized that any attempt to express one's internal world through shared language inevitably results in misrepresentation and oversimplification. There is an inherent distortion in turning private thoughts and emotions into public statements. Each person's inner experience is uniquely their own, deeply personal and essentially untranslatable, no matter how refined or articulate their use of language might be. Because language depends on abstraction, it can never capture the subtle textures of individual experience. Every spoken or written word is a rough estimate of what is truly felt or thought. Likewise, any listener or reader must interpret that language through their own subjective lens, which alters the original meaning in unforeseen ways. Ironically, the very technologies designed to improve communication, shrinking distances and accelerating responses, only worsen the dilemma in Kafka's view. The telephone, for example, embodies the illusion of closeness. It gives the impression of connection while actually preserving and even emphasizing separation. As technology advances, it multiplies the ways in which we can misinterpret each other, even as it raises expectations for clarity and instant understanding, expectations that are impossible to meet. Thus, the more advanced our communication tools become, the more clearly we see the unbridgeable gulf between human minds. The promise of deeper understanding collapses under the weight of increased complexity and false immediacy. Written language in particular poses unique challenges. It lacks the tone, gestures, and immediate feedback present in face-to-face interaction. Letters, memos, and official documents often sow confusion rather than provide clarity. They are interpreted in ways their authors never intended and used for purposes far removed from their original aims. In bureaucratic systems especially, written protocols and regulations become fertile ground for misreading and manipulation. These impersonal texts acquire a kind of autonomous power. What was once intended as a tool for protection or service can be weaponized, turned against the very individuals it was meant to support. Once recorded, words are no longer under the control of their creators. They take on a bureaucratic life of their own. The implications of this linguistic failure are particularly acute within legal and institutional frameworks, where clarity of language is supposed to be of the utmost importance. The effectiveness of laws, rules, and procedures rests on the assumption of a shared understanding of terminology and interpretation. Yet Kafka's work suggests that such mutual comprehension is an illusion. Those engaged in legal processes, be they officials, citizens, attorneys, or defendants, often operate with fundamentally divergent assumptions about what words mean. This disconnect fosters systemic injustices that masquerade as fairness, upheld by the very procedures meant to ensure equality. The assertion that all individuals are equal before the law becomes hollow when the language of the law is incomprehensible or misleading to those it governs. Kafka's characters are frequently caught in the snares of their own speech, finding themselves bound by statements they never intended or positions they never truly embraced. Rather than serving as a bridge, language becomes a snare, capturing its users in intricate networks of meaning from which they cannot free themselves or exert control. Attempts to clarify these unintended statements only deepen the confusion, offering fresh opportunities for misinterpretation and further entrapment. This dynamic mirrors a fundamental aspect of the human condition, the struggle not only to be understood by others but to understand ourselves. Often, it is only in the act of speaking that we realize the uncertainty of our own thoughts. The inability of language to reliably foster connection between people has far-reaching consequences for relationships and social cohesion. Bonds of love, friendship, family, and collaboration all hinge on shared meaning and mutual understanding. Yet Kafka reveals just how tenuous these foundations can be. People may live side by side, labor together, or care deeply for one another, and still remain strangers, united more by habit and routine than by true understanding. This unsettling awareness that we may never fully know those closest to us can be deeply disorienting. It forces us to reevaluate the authenticity of relationships we once took for granted, exposing the emotional distances hidden beneath familiar interactions. However, Kafka also implies that acknowledging the limits of communication might lead to new forms of connection. By accepting that perfect clarity is unattainable, we might respond with greater patience toward misunderstandings and a more generous spirit in interpreting others. The demand for precise, unambiguous expression gives way to a more compassionate effort to grasp the intent behind imperfect words. In this shift, the aim of communication becomes less about flawless transmission and more about the sincerity of the attempt, maintaining connection even when language falters or fails. The emphasis moves to good faith engagement rather than linguistic perfection. This crisis of communication also raises deeper philosophical concerns about the boundary between public discourse and private thought, the difference between what we say to others and what we say to ourselves. Even our inner voice may fall short in articulating the nuances of our experiences, suggesting that language's limitations are not confined to its social use. In some sense, we may remain strangers even to ourselves. The opacity of our own minds only intensifies the difficulty of conveying our inner lives to others. Without a clear understanding of ourselves, the task of genuine interpersonal communication becomes even more complex. In the end, Kafka's exploration of failed communication ties into his larger philosophical themes: the elusiveness of absolute knowledge and the impossibility of complete understanding, whether of the self, other people, or the world. Language, like many human tools, proves insufficient for the immense burdens we place upon it. It becomes yet another arena in which we grapple with the limits of our comprehension and the desire to find meaning. But this recognition does not render communication worthless. On the contrary, it calls for a more humble, tempered approach, one that values the effort to connect, even in the face of likely failure. The real worth of communication may lie not in its accuracy or success, but in what it represents: an ongoing, earnest attempt to reach across the vast spaces of solitude that separate each human mind from every other. Part 4. Time and Temporality. In Kafka's universe, time operates under a logic that resists conventional human understanding. Characters are frequently caught in repetitive cycles, endlessly performing the same actions, waiting for events that never materialize, or undergoing abrupt changes that compress what should be years of development into fleeting moments. This manipulation of temporal perception mirrors profound issues concerning humanity's relationship with time, memory, and duration in the modern world. The usual sense of time as a steady progression from past to present to future collapses entirely. Kafka's characters are suspended in a state of temporal uncertainty, unsure whether anything of importance is happening, about to happen, or has already occurred without their awareness. This breakdown of chronological continuity leaves them emotionally and existentially adrift. A surreal, almost hallucinatory quality surrounds the treatment of time in Kafka's work, most notably in the trial. The legal proceedings in Joseph K's case unfold in a way that seems detached from any normal timeline. While the process drags on indefinitely, without visible progress or resolution, Joseph K feels an urgent, almost unbearable pressure, as though time is running out, even though, by external standards, nothing is actually moving forward. This contrast underscores the discrepancy between internal, subjective time, charged with anxiety and immediacy, and institutional time, which is marked by delay, procedural indifference, and bureaucratic inertia. The result is a form of temporal estrangement that amplifies the alienation already experienced by those ensnared in these opaque systems. Kafka suggests that human beings experience time through an inner rhythm that diverges radically from the mechanical measures of clocks and calendars. Time for Kafka is not something that can be quantified with instruments. A single moment filled with dread or anticipation can stretch endlessly, while years of habitual routine might pass unnoticed, leaving behind no memorable imprint. The psychological intensity of an experience, not its measurable duration, gives it weight in our internal sense of time. This discrepancy between lived time and measured time creates a profound gap between how life is experienced and how it is externally recorded or evaluated. It challenges any easy reconciliation between subjective awareness and objective chronology. One of the most defining features of temporality in Kafka's fiction is the experience of waiting. But this is not ordinary waiting. There is no specific event on the horizon, no known outcome to anticipate. Kafka's characters wait for trials that never start, for permissions that are never granted, for authorities who remain absent, and for changes that are forever incomplete. This waiting isn't a pause in action. It is the action, a condition that permeates their entire existence. Because they have no clear goals to pursue or alternatives to turn to, these characters are locked into waiting. Yet the very act of waiting prevents them from engaging meaningfully with the present. They are paralyzed, unable to inhabit the now, and incapable of moving forward. Kafka's narrative structures reflect this same sense of temporal disorientation. Events unfold without clear causal links or logical sequence. There is no identifiable beginning, middle, or end, just a continuous middle that stretches endlessly, with no resolution in sight. Anything might happen at any time, or nothing might ever happen again. This structural approach mirrors the psychological state of characters whose lives have lost narrative cohesion. Such a portrayal resonates deeply with the modern condition, where historical time appears to have lost its trajectory. The traditional belief in progress is eroded, and the future seems more ominous than hopeful. There is no longer a collective faith in purposeful development. Instead, time feels stagnant or menacingly directionless. In Kafka's world, memory proves to be an unreliable guide. It fails to provide the stable continuity of identity that we often assume our past supplies. Characters struggle to recall what they did yesterday or even what led to their current situations. Past mistakes cannot be examined or avoided because the memory of them is clouded or absent altogether. As a result, the past becomes just as uncertain as the future. Kafka's protagonists are stranded in a present that offers no meaningful context, no clear story of how they arrived there or what comes next. This temporal dislocation deepens the confusion and existential instability that defines so many of his characters. The conflict between individual time and collective or institutional time is especially pronounced in Kafka's depiction of bureaucratic life. Institutions impose rigid schedules and arbitrary deadlines that prioritize their own internal logic, often in total disregard for individual needs or realities. People are forced to adapt their personal rhythms to systems that are indifferent to human complexity, thus reinforcing a profound sense of temporal and existential disjunction. Human energy, focus, and motivation naturally follow organic cycles. Yet these are subordinated to imposed temporal systems designed to optimize efficiency and exert control, rather than to support human flourishing. As a result, individuals become estranged from their intrinsic rhythms, experiencing a kind of temporal disconnection that distances them from their own biological and psychological patterns. In this context, the distinction between work time and personal time becomes stark, fracturing the continuity of human life. The division generates artificial boundaries between what feels purposeful and what feels futile. Individuals often devote the majority of their waking hours to labor that feels detached from their genuine passions or values, reserving slivers of leisure time for what they consider their real lives, intervals that are too brief to allow for true contentment or fulfillment. When time itself becomes commodified, it ceases to function as a vessel for lived experience. Instead, it turns into an economic asset, tracked, traded, and evaluated through market-driven metrics rather than personal meaning. This shift mirrors a broader cultural alienation found in modern industrial life, where estrangement from the self and from nature has become the norm. Kafka's narratives frequently depict a world of cyclical activity where any appearance of progress is deceptive. People find themselves caught in endless loops, repeating the same tasks, visiting the same institutions, interacting with the same functionaries, and following identical protocols that invariably lead to dead ends. This repetition simulates movement, but results in no real advancement. Unlike natural cycles, such as the changing seasons or the ebb and flow of biological processes, Kafka's depiction of time lacks growth or renewal. It is not an organic recurrence, but a mechanical monotony, offering no evolution or resolution. The result is a suffocating sense of being trapped in time rather than aligned with it. The ever-increasing pace of modern life introduces a new form of temporal distress, vividly portrayed in Kafka's works. His characters are constantly urged to act swiftly and decisively, yet they are denied the knowledge or clarity needed for wise or effective decisions. The external world accelerates at a rate that far exceeds their ability to interpret or adjust, leaving them perpetually overwhelmed and lagging behind. This imbalance between the rapid tempo of societal change and the slower rhythm of human cognition generates ongoing stress and confusion. Individuals are disoriented, trying to keep up with a reality that outpaces their capacity to understand it. Nonetheless, Kafka's writings also hint at alternate relationships with time, modes that may offer respite from these modern temporal afflictions. Embracing the unpredictability of the future might liberate us from the exhausting need to control outcomes that are ultimately beyond our reach. Recognizing that significance lies in the quality, not the quantity, of our experiences could shift our focus from how long something lasts to how deeply it is felt. Finally, cultivating a greater presence in the current moment, free from the weight of past regrets and the anxiety of future uncertainties, could open the door to a more authentic and grounded experience of time. Part 5, Death and Mortality. In Kafka's works, death is not a climactic event that brings finality to life, but a persistent force that strips human actions of ultimate significance. His characters exist under the shadow of mortality, fully aware that all they do is fleeting and, in the end, inconsequential. Yet despite this awareness, they continue to behave as if their choices carry lasting importance, trapped in a paradox they cannot resolve. This tension gives rise to a profound conflict. The human impulse to find meaning collides with the undeniable fact of death, which threatens to render all meaning void. Mortality is not merely the conclusion of life. It is the ever-present reality that casts human striving in a tragic, sometimes absurd light, revealing how fragile and desperate our efforts to find purpose truly are. The inevitability of death influences every facet of life, often in ways the characters themselves fail to fully grasp. Knowing that death awaits not only ourselves but everyone we cherish, and that everything we build will one day vanish, shapes our approach to work, love, ambition, and the mundane routines of daily life. This realization can lead to a sense of futility, stifling motivation, and making purposeful action feel absurd. At the same time, the knowledge of mortality can sharpen our perception of life's value, transforming each moment into something singular and irreplaceable. Kafka portrays both reactions. Some characters withdraw into paralysis, overwhelmed by death's finality, while others engage in a frenzied effort to create meaning that might endure beyond their lives. In the Metamorphosis, Gregor Samsa's grotesque transformation can be interpreted as a symbolic form of death in life, a premature exit from social existence that enables Kafka to investigate what it means to be dead to the world while still biologically alive. Gregor remains mentally and emotionally aware, but becomes increasingly irrelevant and invisible to those around him, a metaphor for the isolation that death eventually imposes on all. By the time Gregor dies physically, it feels like a mere formality, an end that had in essence already occurred. His family's swift recovery and renewed vitality underscore a chilling idea, that the death of one may be a necessary condition for the continued life of others, and that letting go of the dying is what allows the living to move forward. In the trial, Kafka presents death as the ultimate, inescapable sentence, one that overrides all attempts at justification or defense. Joseph K. is executed without any clear declaration of guilt or innocence, emphasizing that death comes regardless of moral merit or legal standing. The judicial system is shown not as a mechanism for discerning who deserves death, but as a ceremonial process to accompany an unavoidable reality. The progression of the trial becomes indistinguishable from the passing of life itself, reflecting Kafka's grim view that living is, in effect, a slow movement toward death. In this context, categories like guilt and innocence lose their meaning. The outcome is always the same. Kafka's meditation on death reflects his belief that modern, secular society is ill-equipped to grapple with mortality. Where once religious traditions provided a framework to understand death, offering narratives of redemption, divine judgment, or eternal life, modernity leaves individuals with no such spiritual context. Death, stripped of metaphysical meaning, becomes nothing more than a full stop, final, arbitrary, and empty. As a result, people must face the prospect of death alone, without the support of cultural or institutional guidance to help them live meaningfully in the face of an unavoidable end. Kafka often returns to the unsettling randomness of death's arrival. His characters live with the persistent anxiety that death can come at any time, without warning or preparation, and beyond their ability to influence. This unpredictability makes it impossible to construct a rational life plan or to secure the sense of control and stability that human beings instinctively crave. Every long-term ambition, every hope for future happiness, is haunted by the looming possibility of sudden death, casting doubt on whether any of it is worth the effort, even as we continue to strive toward it. Kafka also gives considerable attention to the communal and relational dimensions of mortality. He explores how the certainty of death affects the bonds between people, how it generates both a desperate yearning for connection and a deep fear of the inevitable losses such connections bring. The result is a tragic duality. The closer we grow to others, the more exposed we become to grief. Love becomes intricately bound with the knowledge that every person we care for will one day pass away, leaving us behind to grieve them, or else we'll go first and leave them to grieve us. This fundamental imbalance in timing ensures that every intimate bond carries within it the inevitable possibility of loss. The priorities of professional ambition and financial gain in contemporary life often seem bizarrely disproportionate when seen through the lens of our mortality. People devote vast amounts of energy to climbing career ladders and securing material comfort, all of which death will eventually erase. Regardless of its futility, the chase for recognition, wealth, and social standing persists, despite the inescapable truth that death strips these accomplishments of any lasting significance. This contradiction suggests either a willful denial of our finite existence or a frantic effort to impose meaning on lives we know will end, an existential deflection through busyness. However, Kafka's work also proposes that confronting death honestly can sharpen our sense of purpose and bring clarity to our choices. By embracing the reality that our time is limited, we might begin to prioritize more wisely, directing our efforts toward what genuinely matters to us, rather than being driven by social convention or inherited expectations. An awareness of our mortality can thus become a filter, helping us separate what feels truly valuable from what merely occupies our days or earns the approval of others. Throughout Kafka's writings, art emerges as both a response to death and a recognition of its power. Creative expression represents an effort to preserve moments, to communicate across time, and to leave a trace of one's existence. Yet even this effort is shadowed by the realization that no artistic endeavor can defy death's finality. Works of art that survive their creators do so beyond the creator's control, open to interpretations that may bear little resemblance to the original intention. In this way, art provides a kind of symbolic permanence while simultaneously exposing the limits of human efforts to achieve literal immortality. Ultimately, Kafka's engagement with mortality leads us to deeper questions about how to live authentically in the face of impermanence. This inquiry calls for what might be described as a form of mortal wisdom, a capacity to live meaningfully within the constraints of a finite life. Such wisdom does not involve evading or denying death's inevitability, nor does it surrender to despair. Instead, it seeks to build significance and value that do not rely on eternal endurance. The aim is not to escape mortality, but to inhabit it fully, to live deeply and deliberately, conscious of the limits that death imposes and the urgency it creates. Part 6. Father-son relationships and family dynamics. Kafka's writing is deeply infused with the recurring theme of father-son conflict, which transcends personal familial tension to reflect larger issues of authority, defiance, and the intergenerational inheritance of psychological trauma. In Kafka's world, paternal dominance generates a profound sense of guilt in sons, who attempt to resolve this guilt through suffering and a longing for redemption. Yet this resolution remains forever out of reach. Rather than achieving closure, the same painful dynamics resurface in successive generations, with sons inevitably evolving into the very fathers they once feared or resented. This cycle of dysfunction suggests that what may seem like individual psychological wounds are, in fact, symptoms of more deeply rooted structural imbalances in how power and affection are distributed within families and societal institutions. Kafka's own troubled relationship with his father, Hermann Kafka, shaped his understanding of parental authority as a potentially damaging force rather than a nurturing one. Hermann, a prosperous businessman, placed high value on discipline, societal respectability, and material accomplishment, values that sharply contrasted with Franz Kafka's artistic inclinations and intellectual sensitivities. His father's imposing presence, emotional unpredictability, and tangible success set a standard Kafka felt perpetually unworthy of reaching, instilling in him a persistent sense of failure and inferiority. These personal struggles served as the emotional and conceptual foundation for Kafka's broader literary examination of how authority figures often stifle rather than support those in their care. Kafka's 1919 letter to his father, a document he never sent, stands as his most candid confrontation with these complex familial dynamics. In it, Kafka seeks to convey how his father's overwhelming authority undermined his ability to act freely or connect genuinely with others. At the same time, the letter reveals Kafka's continued emotional entanglement and yearning for paternal validation, even as he articulates his grievances. The act of composing the letter itself reflects Kafka's urgent need to be understood, alongside a painful awareness that such understanding might remain forever elusive. It embodies the paradox of needing to escape an oppressive relationship while still being psychologically anchored to it. Kafka expands the notion of paternal authority beyond the literal father figure to include institutional and societal forms of control that adopt a paternalistic posture. In his narratives, figures such as bureaucrats, employers, clergy, and other authority representatives often assume symbolic father roles, exercising power that infantilizes rather than empowers those under their influence. These surrogate fathers demand loyalty and gratitude, yet rarely offer clear guidance or genuine concern for the well-being of their subordinates. The result is a society populated by individuals who remain emotionally stunted, unable to cultivate independent judgment or exercise personal agency due to lifelong subjugation. At the same time, Kafka also portrays the dangers posed by the absent or ineffectual father. The lack of strong paternal support can cause just as much harm as authoritarian control. In the Metamorphosis, Gregor Samsa's father is initially portrayed as a broken man, financially dependent and emotionally disengaged. However, when Gregor's transformation forces him to reassume responsibility, he responds with sudden brutality and rejection, attacking his son with violent disdain. This shift illustrates how men who once seemed powerless may react to challenges to their authority by becoming excessively authoritarian, overcorrecting their prior inadequacy with aggression and emotional withdrawal. Kafka pays special attention to the economic dynamics that underpin many father-son relationships, especially the ways in which financial dependence reinforces unhealthy psychological patterns. Adult children who are unable to attain financial autonomy remain locked in infantilized roles, with parents maintaining dominance through economic leverage. Conversely, when children like Gregor become the primary financial providers, they may hold economic power while remaining emotionally subservient to parents who silently resent their dependency. In these situations, money becomes a tool, used consciously or unconsciously, by either generation to assert control or resist subjugation. It functions not merely as a practical necessity, but as a psychological weapon in the ongoing negotiation of family authority. Finally, Kafka suggests that the transmission of emotional and behavioral patterns across generations occurs with near inescapable regularity. Even as sons pledge to break free from the flaws of their fathers, they often find themselves replicating the very behaviors they once condemned. This repetition of familial dysfunction underscores a central theme in Kafka's work: the seemingly inescapable legacy of parental influence and the quiet tragedy of becoming what one most feared. Family dynamics often operate beneath the surface of conscious awareness, shaped by deep-seated emotional currents and ingrained behavioral patterns that are resistant to change through intention alone. Escaping harmful familial cycles demands more than understanding. It calls for persistent effort to establish new forms of connection, often without any reference point from past experiences. Mothers often play complex and conflicted roles in these dynamics. At times, they may stand by passively as tensions between fathers and sons escalate, powerless to intervene. In other cases, they may become enmeshed in the dysfunction by offering excessive protection or engaging in emotional manipulation. In trying to counterbalance a father's severity, A mother might overcompensate with indulgence, inadvertently fostering dependency and stunted emotional growth. Alternatively, some mothers align themselves with the father's authority, reinforcing his dominance through their own maternal influence. This alliance can make a child's resistance seem not only difficult, but morally indefensible. Positioned between father and son, the mother often becomes entangled in a dynamic she neither initiated nor fully comprehends, yet one that deeply affects her and those around her. Kafka's portrayal of sibling relationships frequently mirrors the chaos born from unstable parental authority. Brothers and sisters are often cast as rivals, competing for the scarce resources of parental attention and affection. These early conflicts can harden into enduring resentments, making deep, supportive sibling bonds nearly impossible. When parents show favoritism, it sows jealousy and bitterness that corrode the possibility of genuine closeness. At times, the siblings may unite in opposition to parental authority, but these alliances are typically fragile. As soon as individual desires clash with shared interests, such unity tends to unravel, reinforcing the isolating effects of family dysfunction. The effects of these broken family relationships are not limited to the home. They ripple outward, influencing Kafka's broader critique of political and institutional power. Individuals raised under arbitrary or manipulative parental authority may become conditioned to accept similar dynamics in societal institutions. They might gravitate toward authoritarian figures who appear to offer the safety and structure their families failed to provide, or they may themselves become controlling in an attempt to reclaim a sense of agency lost in childhood. This intertwining of the personal and the political reveals how early family experiences shape a person's lifelong relationship with authority. The patterns learned at home become the framework through which power is perceived and enacted in society. Even so, Kafka offers glimpses of hope, paths toward liberation from these entrenched patterns. True freedom, he suggests, begins with self-awareness, recognizing the extent to which family dynamics have molded one's personality and interpersonal behavior. From there, it becomes possible to consciously choose new ways of relating that break with the past. The objective is not to reject all forms of authority or obligation, but rather to discern between power that is just and constructive and power that is coercive and damaging, both within the family and beyond it. Overcoming the pathologies of the family thus serves as a metaphor and a method for wider emancipation from all oppressive systems of control. Part 7. The Absurd Universe. Franz Kafka held the conviction that human life is intrinsically and inescapably absurd. This belief went far beyond the notion that life is merely harsh or unfair. For Kafka, absurdity was a deeper, more disquieting reality. The idea that the universe lacks any coherent or discoverable rational structure that humans could hope to comprehend. Although we inhabit a world that seems to operate through systems and established norms, Kafka saw these as ultimately arbitrary and devoid of true significance. He once suggested that humanity might be the outcome of a particularly unfortunate day in the mind of God, an evocative metaphor expressing his view that existence itself is a kind of cosmic blunder. Where many philosophers have tried to impose meaning on suffering or construct elaborate frameworks to explain life's hardships, Kafka stood apart. He insisted that the absence of meaning is the fundamental condition of existence. There is no hidden truth waiting to be unearthed. There is no grand design to illuminate our pain, no higher order that redeems our struggles, no cosmic fairness to set the world right. This led Kafka to identify what he considered the core contradiction of the human condition. We are beings who crave meaning, yet we find ourselves trapped in a reality that offers none. Despite all evidence to the contrary, we continue to search for answers, cling to patterns, and yearn for resolution, even when reason makes it clear that none can be found. This, Kafka believed, is not a stage to be outgrown with wisdom or spiritual enlightenment. It is the enduring nature of human existence. The absurdity he described permeates every part of daily life. We adhere to routines with no ultimate significance, engage with institutions whose purposes remain opaque, and obey authorities whose right to rule is unproven. Day after day, we wake to repeat meaningless tasks, soothing ourselves with narratives of progress and success, constructed to hide the underlying futility. Kafka stripped away these comforting illusions to reveal the raw absurdity beneath them. In his fiction, this philosophical vision is embodied in surreal, often nightmarish scenarios that resist any rational explanation. In one tale, a traveling salesman wakes to discover he has turned into a monstrous insect, with no cause or rationale offered. In another, a bank clerk is arrested for a crime that is never explained by nameless officials, and he is given no way to defend himself. In yet another story, a land surveyor arrives at a village for a job at a distant castle, but he is perpetually unable to reach it or meet anyone with real authority. These strange events are not symbolic puzzles to be decoded. They are not allegories pointing toward hidden truths. They are stark illustrations of the absurd reality Kafka saw all around him. He deliberately withheld explanations or neat conclusions because he believed the very desire for answers was symptomatic of our problem. We yearn for the universe to be intelligible, but it is not. And our refusal to accept this only deepens our anguish. For Kafka, absurdity is not an occasional disruption that strikes in moments of crisis. It is the essential fabric of reality, embedded in every mundane aspect of life. Whether we go to our jobs, follow societal rules, maintain relationships, or chase ambitions, we are participating in systems that, at their core, lack any lasting rationale or justification. The fact that these systems appear normal and necessary doesn't make them any less absurd. It merely reveals how thoroughly we've trained ourselves to ignore their emptiness. Kafka recognized that most people cannot face the full weight of this absurdity. To cope, we construct elaborate psychological defenses. We tell ourselves that our efforts have meaning, that progress is achievable, that justice will prevail in the end. These beliefs may be comforting, but they are illusions, fabrications that help us function without succumbing to despair. However, the truth remains. Part 8. Existential Responsibility and Freedom. Kafka remained deeply preoccupied with what he saw as the core paradox of human existence, the challenge of making responsible, meaningful commitments in a universe devoid of inherent logic or purpose. This existential conflict lies at the center of his philosophical worldview. Despite the absence of divine order or universal meaning, we are still compelled to make decisions and bear the full weight of their consequences. As existentialist thinkers would later articulate, we are condemned to be free, obligated to invent our own values in a world that offers no inherent moral structure. In a reality stripped of metaphysical direction, human beings must nonetheless strive to live ethically, even though death ultimately nullifies all meaning. This contradiction creates a profound and painful tension in human awareness. On one hand, we know our actions lack eternal significance. On the other, we are haunted by the sense that our decisions are deeply important to our sense of self and moral identity. Every choice becomes a reflection of who we are. Yet we often lack any firm criteria for what constitutes a good or virtuous choice. Kafka examined this dilemma through characters placed in impossible situations, forced to act without the benefit of clear moral instruction. His protagonists cannot rely on religious doctrine, institutional authority, or societal norms for guidance. They find themselves in moments that demand immediate decisions, yet every available option appears flawed, insufficient, or morally ambiguous. This condition mirrors the modern human experience, the necessity of choosing between right and wrong without access to any absolute moral certainty. The crushing weight of this moral autonomy produces what philosophers describe as existential anxiety. This is not a fear tied to specific threats or events, but a more fundamental unease, one born from the realization that we alone are responsible for shaping our existence. When we accept that we are the sole authors of our lives, the comforting narrative that we are merely products of fate, upbringing, or biology begins to unravel. We lose the luxury of blaming our parents, our environment, our DNA, or our social context for the people we become and the paths we choose. Kafka extended this idea even further. He believed that personal identity is forged not only through major life decisions, but also in the countless small moments that make up daily existence. Every instance of integrity or compromise, every decision to act with kindness or cruelty, every impulse to confront life or retreat from it, each one contributes to the person we are becoming. We are engaged in an ongoing process of self-creation, shaped by how we respond to the challenges life presents. This responsibility grows even more daunting when we acknowledge that our choices ripple outward, influencing not just our own lives, but the lives of others. In the Metamorphosis, Gregor Samsa's transformation into an insect can be seen as the inevitable result of his own decisions: to detach emotionally from his family, to pour himself into a job he despises, and to neglect his own needs in favor of servitude. His metamorphosis is symbolic, a physical manifestation of a life surrendered to self-effacement, but it also highlights how his family's dynamic is shaped by his willingness to sacrifice himself for their comfort. Moral responsibility, Kafka suggests, is not isolated, it is relational. Our actions extend beyond us in ways we cannot always anticipate or manage. Kafka also refused to accept that ignorance absolves anyone of ethical accountability. His characters frequently operate without full understanding, uncertain of the rules, unaware of consequences, or even blind to the reasons behind their suffering. Yet this lack of clarity does not diminish their responsibility. In the trial, Joseph K. never discovers the nature of the charges against him, but he remains responsible for how he responds to the ordeal he faces. Even within a system that is senseless and unfair, the individual remains obligated to uphold their own dignity and inner truth. In Kafka's vision of the world, freedom is not the comforting liberal ideal of unrestricted personal choice or the absence of external interference. Instead, it is a far more profound and unsettling freedom, the inescapable obligation to own our existence completely without any ultimate rationale to justify the decisions we make. This kind of freedom is not something we can reject or evade through conformity, rebellion, or detachment, because it is woven into the very fabric of our conscious being. Even the refusal to make a decision is, in itself, a form of decision, one for which we are entirely accountable. This existential concept of responsibility also implies that we cannot offload our moral agency onto others. We cannot excuse our actions by claiming we were merely obeying authority, fulfilling professional duties, or aligning with social norms. Every act of compliance or defiance exposes a deeper truth about who we are striving to become. Kafka presents us with characters who attempt to shrug off this weight of responsibility by vanishing into bureaucratic machinery or immersing themselves in familial roles, but in doing so, they merely hollow out their own humanity. This burden of responsibility reaches into our relationship with truth and meaning as well. In a universe devoid of preordained answers, we are compelled to take ownership of the search for truth and the construction of meaning, even as we confront the possibility that such efforts may ultimately fail. To give up this search, to accept convenient falsehoods, or to surrender to nihilistic despair is still a moral decision, one that reveals the contours of our inner character. Kafka intimates that the act of searching, even without arriving at definitive answers, carries intrinsic value. What makes this existential responsibility even more daunting is that it must be exercised without the comfort of certainty. We cannot ever be fully assured that our decisions are correct, that our values are grounded, or that our actions will produce the intended results. Yet this fundamental uncertainty does not grant us the right to withdraw into passivity or moral indifference. We are still obligated to act, to choose, based on the clearest understanding available to us at the time, all while recognizing the possibility of being wrong. And we must be prepared to bear the full weight of whatever consequences may follow. Part 9, Alienation and Isolation. At the core of Kafka's most profound anguish lies a deep-seated estrangement, not merely from individual people, but from the possibility of genuine human connection or any form of transcendent truth. This is not the passing solitude one might feel in moments of separation or misunderstanding, but a more fundamental condition of disconnection that seems inherent to human existence. Kafka's protagonists are portrayed as irrevocably detached, not only from their families and communities, but even from themselves. Their isolation is not the result of circumstance, but appears as a built-in feature of the modern world, permanent, not incidental. This profound alienation often first emerges in the collapse of familial bonds. In the Metamorphosis, Gregor Samsa's grotesque change into a giant insect does not cause his separation from his family. It rather brings to light a growing disconnection that already existed. Even before his transformation, Gregor had lost emotional intimacy with his family, buried under the weight of his responsibilities as the sole provider. He had no room to follow his own aspirations or build genuine relationships. The metamorphosis itself exposes, in a startlingly literal way, the invisible distance that had always been there in the guise of ordinary domestic life. His outward transformation acts as a symbolic representation of the inner reality of being alienated from one's own identity and place in the world. The insect form captures his internal experience of being insignificant, dehumanized, and cut off from society. Yet this metaphor also works in reverse. Gregor's family, long before his physical change, had already failed to recognize his humanity. They valued him not as a person, but as a provider, as a means to an economic end, rather than a being with intrinsic worth or emotional needs. Kafka's vision of alienation stretches far beyond the private sphere. His characters often find themselves removed from society at large, having come to terms with the absurdity and meaninglessness of conventional life. As they reject societal illusions and false comforts, they drift further from collective norms and shared understandings. However, this deeper awareness brings no comfort, only a sharper sense of isolation. To see the world clearly in Kafka's universe is to stand alone. The cost of insight is separation from those who still find solace in shared illusions. Employment, too, becomes a stage for this existential estrangement. Kafka's central figures frequently occupy roles that feel empty and detached, going through the motions in jobs that serve systems they neither understand nor believe in. Gregor, for instance, is trapped in a career as a traveling salesman, a job he detests but endures for the sake of his family's financial survival. Similarly, Joseph K. works at a bank, completing tasks that appear arbitrary, disconnected from any meaningful objective or moral framework. This professional disillusionment reflects a broader critique of modern industrial life. People are reduced to components in vast, impersonal systems that follow their own internal logic. These systems are opaque and indifferent, their goals far removed from the daily realities of the workers who sustain them. Increasing bureaucratization and hyper-specialization have fragmented human effort into narrowly defined tasks, robbing most individuals of any sense of purpose or completion. Labor in this setting becomes deeply alienating, a draining expenditure of life force with no reward in meaning or fulfillment. Kafka's depiction of alienation also involves a rupture in the experience of time, a disconnection from both past and future. His characters seem adrift, without access to inherited wisdom or historical continuity that could offer grounding or direction. The rapid transformation of the world has rendered the lessons of previous generations obsolete. At the same time, they struggle to envision any meaningful future, as the trajectory of change feels chaotic, opaque, and immune to human influence. Language, rather than serving as a bridge between people, often becomes a source of estrangement. In Kafka's fiction, communication repeatedly breaks down, not because characters are silent, but because their words fail to express what they intend, or are consistently misunderstood by others. The very means we rely on to connect with others instead become obstacles that highlight our solitude. Even when individuals use the same vocabulary, their meanings diverge so widely that mutual understanding becomes nearly impossible. As a result, conversations in Kafka's world frequently produce confusion rather than clarity. Kafka's personal context adds another layer to this theme of alienation. As a German-speaking Jew living in Prague under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he inhabited a space defined by overlapping identities and marginalization. This sense of cultural and geographic dislocation is echoed in his characters, who are often placed in strange or foreign settings, unable to comprehend the social norms or logic that govern their surroundings. Such disorientation becomes a powerful metaphor for the modern human experience, where even in familiar places, one can feel like a stranger. But this disconnection isn't limited to the external world. It extends inward as well. Kafka's protagonists often grapple with a profound estrangement from themselves. They struggle to identify their own motives, emotions, and desires, encountering a troubling distance between who they are and who they imagine themselves to be. This lack of self-understanding deprives them of the inner coherence needed for authentic living. Consequently, their internal confusion compounds their social isolation, locking them in a cycle of alienation from both others and themselves. More unsettling still is the absence of any clear source of higher meaning or transcendence. In Kafka's universe, traditional anchors, whether religious, natural, or societal, offer no refuge. God, if he exists at all, remains silent or impossibly remote. Nature offers no solace or direction. Human institutions are reduced to senseless bureaucracies, governed by arbitrary, incomprehensible rules. Individuals are thus left completely adrift, without any external system to help them understand the purpose of their suffering or the value of their choices. Yet Kafka also intimates that recognizing this alienation might be the first step toward a more honest form of existence. By ceasing to deny our fundamental aloneness, by confronting the reality of our disconnection, we may create the conditions for more sincere relationships with ourselves and with others. Attempts to escape alienation through illusions or false connections only intensify the very loneliness they aim to cure. In embracing alienation as an unavoidable part of human life, we may paradoxically discover a path toward deeper meaning and more authentic human connection. Part 10. Bureaucracy and Authority. At the core of Kafka's most haunting and surreal stories lies a labyrinthine bureaucracy, an apparatus that has evolved not through deliberate design, but through inertia, passive acceptance, and the slow consolidation of political authority. These institutions sustain themselves by consuming the rights and freedoms of the very people they purport to protect. Kafka foresaw with unsettling clarity that the modern age would be ruled by sprawling, impersonal structures. These entities, while claiming to fulfill human needs, in reality exert control over individuals, narrowing their choices and eroding their potential. His depiction of bureaucratic dominance has only become more strikingly accurate as such systems have grown in size and complexity long after his time. The chains that bind suffering humanity are not forged of iron, but of paper, documents and forms that circulate endlessly among countless officials. These individuals, though seemingly insignificant in isolation, are empowered by their passive obedience to the bureaucratic machine that grants them legitimacy. As the paperwork multiplies, it becomes the primary instrument through which governing forces assert their influence over private lives. Modern bureaucracies derive their authority from written records, meticulously maintained in original or duplicated forms. These documents become permanent fixtures, tools for monitoring and managing citizens with precision and persistence. Within Kafka's world, bureaucratic officials are arrayed in a rigid hierarchy, ranked legions stretching from remote, unreachable authorities at the top to the obedient but still potent subordinates below. This structure mirrors spiritual cosmologies of angels and demons, where each tier rules over the one beneath it while remaining answerable to the tier above. Yet, unlike divine hierarchies which claim to fulfill a higher moral order, the bureaucratic order exists solely to sustain itself. Officials rarely know the identities of those above them, limiting their roles to executing orders they neither question nor fully comprehend. Their authority is hollow, defined by adherence rather than understanding. The true brilliance and horror of modern bureaucratic power lies in its dispersion of responsibility. When failures occur, no single individual is to blame. Everyone merely follows established procedures, created by others, implemented without scrutiny. The system becomes a self-perpetuating entity, governed by internal rules often divorced from the actual needs of the people it governs. In such a framework, decisions are made without a clear decision-maker. Yet their consequences reach all corners of society. This results in a type of authority that operates without any real accountability. Bureaucracies flourish through the production of pointless labor. Layers of inefficiency accumulate, diminishing individual freedom while bolstering the system's own permanence. The proliferation of protocols, forms, and regulations projects an illusion of order and rationality, all the while obstructing genuine progress or action. Individuals find themselves ensnared in an endless cycle of paperwork and approvals, processes devoid of clear purpose beyond maintaining the machinery itself. The system ceases to serve any external mission and instead becomes a self-sustaining loop. This produces what scholars have defined as three key features of bureaucratic existence: inertia, powerlessness, and futility. Inertia emerges as people are discouraged from taking initiative or thinking creatively. Instead, they must await permission and adhere to inflexible procedures. Powerlessness takes hold when individuals recognize that their efforts have little or no effect on outcomes dictated by opaque institutional mechanisms. The final condition, futility, sets in when individuals can no longer discern any meaningful purpose behind the bureaucratic tasks they are compelled to perform or suffer through. The system's logic becomes a black box, and in the absence of visible goals, life within it begins to feel not just constrained, but senseless. Kafka's The Trial offers the most thorough investigation of bureaucratic dominance found in his work. In this novel, Joseph K. becomes ensnared in a judicial apparatus that operates entirely in the shadows. It functions according to obscure regulations that no one will explain, leaving him in complete ignorance about the nature of the charges against him. He is never told what crime he is alleged to have committed, what evidence exists, or how he might go about defending himself. Nonetheless, this unseen system maintains absolute control over every aspect of his existence. The legal authorities are empowered to surveil him, curtail his freedom, and eventually carry out his execution, without ever offering a single justification for their decisions. The court Kafka envisions embodies the ultimate dystopian bureaucracy, a structure that claims to uphold justice, but in truth exists solely to sustain and perpetuate its own authority. In this world, the process of investigation becomes indistinguishable from the delivery of judgment. To be accused is, in effect, to be condemned. This system is constructed so that it cannot admit the possibility of error. Any form of resistance or attempt at clarification is immediately interpreted as a sign of guilt. It becomes a self-contained mechanism, hermetically sealed against criticism, where no reform or challenge is possible from within. Kafka lays bare how such bureaucracies gradually reshape the very individuals who operate within them. Officials, no matter their rank, begin to derive a sense of purpose and status from the procedures and hierarchies that define their roles. Over time, they lose sight of any higher goals or values beyond the preservation of the institutional machine itself. Even minor clerks or functionaries find themselves personally invested in maintaining the system's complexity and opacity, because it's precisely this that lends value to their specialized knowledge. But the influence of bureaucratic control extends well beyond the workplace. Kafka illustrates how people begin to internalize its logic, adopting bureaucratic behaviors in their everyday lives. They become increasingly passive, bound by rules, and hesitant to take risks. Individuals start to see themselves not as whole persons, but as files to be managed, objects to be processed through impersonal systems. This mindset permeates society, shaping how people think and act in the realms of family life, education, healthcare, and virtually every other facet of human experience. Yet Kafka also implies that this seemingly invincible structure contains the seeds of its own undoing. Its survival hinges entirely on the willingness of people to accept its authority and comply with its rituals. At one point, the servant girl Pepe tells Kay that if he truly wished to break free from the lords of the castle, all he would need to do is burn it down, like a sheet of paper tossed into a stove. Paper, after all, ignites quickly and leaves almost nothing behind. This striking image underscores a fundamental truth about bureaucratic power. For all its oppressive reach and overwhelming complexity, it is, at heart, incredibly fragile. Its vast apparatus of control functions only because people agree, often unconsciously, to go along with it. When individuals begin to reject meaningless rituals and refuse to bow to arbitrary commands, the whole edifice starts to crumble. It begins to lose its hold, not just over society, but over reality itself. Part 11, Guilt and Shame. A recurring motif throughout Kafka's body of work is the fraught dynamic between father and son, where guilt is inherited rather than earned, and where the son seeks relief through suffering and acts of penance. However, Kafka's depiction of guilt is not confined to familial bonds. He expands it into a broader existential framework, treating guilt as an inherent condition of human awareness. His characters frequently experience guilt without understanding its cause, or feel culpable for events entirely beyond their influence. This reflects Kafka's conviction that guilt is less about moral failings and more about the human condition itself. An existence lived in a world that is both indecipherable and indifferent, if not outright antagonistic. Kafka's protagonists often grapple with feelings of guilt that far exceed any real misdeed. In the trial, for instance, Joseph K's continual sense of guilt does not emerge from genuine wrongdoing, but from the psychological pressure inflicted by an opaque and merciless bureaucracy that steadily wears down his resistance. The legal apparatus in Kafka's universe is not concerned with discerning guilt or innocence. Instead, its function is to instill a sense of guilt regardless of the facts. Through this, Kafka illustrates how systems of authority can reshape our moral compass, persuading individuals to internalize blame and believe they merit the punishment or constraints imposed on them. Kafka recognized that modern mechanisms of control rarely rely on overt force. Rather, they succeed by persuading individuals to see themselves as inherently defective. This internalized guilt causes people to monitor their own behavior, accept unjust rules, and relinquish their freedoms, all because they believe they are undeserving of anything better. Such manipulation is more insidious than brute coercion, precisely because it transforms victims into agents of their own submission. People who are convinced of their own unworthiness willingly participate in the very systems that diminish them. This internal guilt is further amplified in a moral landscape devoid of clear ethical direction. In Kafka's world, every decision is shadowed by the fear of having chosen wrongly. The abundance of options, rather than granting freedom, deepens anxiety and paralysis. Characters are frequently caught in a state of indecision, unable to differentiate right from wrong, and therefore unable to commit to a course of action. This moral ambiguity leaves them unmoored, unable to find peace or certainty. Freedom in such a context becomes a curse, its weight unbearable without the assurance that one's choices are just or meaningful. Closely entwined with Kafka's exploration of guilt is his treatment of shame, which he presents not as the result of specific actions, but as a deep-seated emotion tied to one's very being. While guilt relates to what we have done, shame pertains to who we are. In Kafka's narratives, characters are often burdened by the feeling that their mere existence is a mistake or a source of discomfort to others. This existential shame is immune to confession or redemption. It does not stem from wrongdoing, but from an ingrained belief in one's own unacceptability. Perhaps no work captures this more poignantly than the Metamorphosis. Gregor Samsa's transformation into a monstrous insect is a powerful metaphor for the sense of being inherently repulsive and unworthy. His family's growing disgust and eventual rejection of him echo Kafka's own feelings of alienation, especially as a Jewish man living in a predominantly Christian society. Gregor's grotesque new form symbolizes how the marginalized are made to feel, not merely different, but revolting and dangerous to the social fabric. Kafka's characters are often preoccupied with concealing their shame. In a telling moment, Gregor covers himself with a sheet to spare his family the sight of his transformed body. This act reflects both a desire to protect others and a painful internal acceptance of their disgust. It is a small but devastating attempt to retain a shred of dignity, even while conceding that one is, at their core, an object of shame. The true tragedy of the metamorphosis lies not in Gregor's physical transformation, but in his readiness to accept his family's verdict that he has become something vile and unworthy of love or belonging. Kafka explores how guilt and shame are not only personal emotions, but also legacies passed down through generations and embedded within cultural structures. His recurring theme of conflict between fathers and sons reflects a broader psychological inheritance. The son struggles to free himself from emotional patterns established long before his time. Each generation carries the weight of having failed the previous one, creating an unending loop of guilt and resentment. This cycle of emotional entrapment becomes so normalized that it appears natural, inevitable even, rather than something learned and capable of being unlearned. Kafka presents the most systematic and oppressive forms of guilt through his portrayal of religious and legal institutions. These systems present themselves as guardians of justice and morality, yet in practice, they manufacture and sustain a sense of inadequacy within the people they govern. By demanding unattainable ideals of conduct and framing human frailty as moral failing, they trap individuals in a perpetual state of guilt. Even their promises of redemption hinge on submission, reinforcing dependence rather than offering liberation. In this setup, the supposed solution to guilt merely deepens it, creating a constant stream of people seeking absolution for offenses they may never have actually committed. However, Kafka also implies that the overwhelming burden of such guilt can ultimately expose its artificial roots. When the level of guilt one experiences is grossly disproportionate to any real wrongdoing, its true nature as a tool of social manipulation becomes clear. The extreme situation faced by Joseph K. in the trial reveals how absurd and irrational guilt can become when it is detached from authentic moral failings. This absurdity invites us to question the validity of all guilt that lacks a basis in sincere ethical reflection and personal responsibility. Recognizing this manipulation allows us to separate true moral awareness from shame that has been socially imposed. In Kafka's world, resolution rarely comes through conventional ideas of atonement or forgiveness. Instead, characters are challenged to discern the difference between guilt that serves a meaningful moral function and guilt designed only to weaken their sense of self. This requires a kind of moral courage, the strength to rely on one's own ethical reasoning instead of yielding automatically to external authorities. Real moral responsibility begins not with blind obedience, but with the refusal to accept illegitimate guilt and the embrace of accountability for one's genuine actions and their consequences. Kafka's treatment of guilt thus leads to deeper questions about what it means to act ethically and be responsible in a world where traditional sources of moral authority no longer hold sway. In such a world, individuals must cultivate their own capacity for ethical judgment. This does not mean taking on blame for everything that goes wrong, nor does it permit us to avoid responsibility altogether. Instead, the challenge is to ensure that guilt becomes a force for true moral clarity rather than a means of control or self-erasure. The objective is not the eradication of guilt, but its rightful placement, anchored in authenticity, not oppression. Part 12. Transformation and Metamorphosis. Transformation stands out as one of the central themes and enduring archetypes in Kafka's body of work, symbolizing the sudden, often unexplainable shifts that define the human experience. These changes are frequently physical, extreme, and irreversible, demonstrating how life can be upended in an instant without warning, justification, or any hope of returning to a previous state. Kafka employs transformation as a profound metaphor for the internal psychological and spiritual shifts that people undergo, often involuntarily and beyond their comprehension. At times, we find ourselves awakening to a world that no longer resembles what we thought we knew, realizing that the foundations of our identity and reality have been irrevocably altered. The most iconic instance of this theme appears in the Metamorphosis, where the protagonist, Gregor Samsa, wakes to discover he has been turned into a giant insect. This transformation comes without cause or explanation, compelling both Gregor and his family to confront their true selves, stripped of the roles and expectations that once defined them. What this transformation ultimately exposes is that Gregor's alienation did not begin with his physical mutation. Long before his body changed, he was emotionally and socially isolated, trapped in a soul-crushing job, and burdened by the expectations of a family that largely valued him for his ability to provide financially. His outward metamorphosis merely externalizes a dehumanization that had been festering silently in his everyday life. Kafka proposes that all humans are in a state of perpetual transformation, though such changes often unfold so slowly or subtly that we remain unaware of them. Through our decisions, experiences, and reactions to forces beyond our control, we are always becoming new versions of ourselves. The physical metamorphoses depicted in Kafka's stories serve as exaggerated symbols for the continuous emotional and ethical evolution we undergo. Every meaningful event in our lives alters us in some fashion, subtly reshaping our identity. These shifts may go unnoticed until much later, when we realize we are no longer the people we once were. Kafka's use of transformation frequently highlights the arbitrary and precarious nature of human identity. While we like to believe in the stability and consistency of our personalities, our values, our sense of self, Kafka illustrates just how quickly that illusion can unravel. A respected worker can become a grotesque insect. A free individual may find themselves trapped within an incomprehensible system. The confident self can dissolve into confusion and helplessness when confronted with overwhelming external forces. These abrupt changes push Kafka's characters to reevaluate everything they previously accepted as certain: their roles, their relationships, and the foundations of their worldview. Gregor's metamorphosis forces him to rethink not only his connection to his family and job, but also his physical needs and his status within society. The transformation dismantles the frameworks that once gave his life coherence and significance. Such extreme disorientation presents both a terrifying loss of meaning and a potential path toward deeper self-understanding. Kafka also investigates how transformation extends its reach beyond the individual, impacting everyone around them. Gregor's condition compels his family to face truths they had previously ignored: their reliance on him, their values, and their capacity for compassion or cruelty. His sister Greta undergoes her own metamorphosis, from a passive girl to a capable young woman, partly catalyzed by the upheaval in their home. His father, once weak and ineffectual, is driven to reclaim authority and assert control over the household. Meanwhile, the mother is forced into an agonizing position, having to choose between her loyalty to her son and her obligation to the rest of the family. The novel critiques a societal structure that prioritizes output and efficiency at the expense of genuine human connection and personal well-being. Once Gregor is no longer able to fulfill his role as the family's breadwinner, he is no longer valued as a person, but instead becomes a burden in their eyes. This shift exposes how their affection was tied not to love, but to his ability to provide economically. This dynamic illustrates how deeply capitalist ideologies infiltrate even the most personal of relationships, shaping them around usefulness rather than unconditional care. Gregor's metamorphosis lays bare the harsh reality of reducing human beings to their economic function, stripping them of their inherent dignity and individuality. In Kafka's work, transformation isn't solely a force of ruin or despair. It also holds the potential for liberation, from stifling roles, from social expectations, and even from parts of the self long buried or repressed. The metamorphosis of Gregor's sister stands in stark contrast to his own decline, illustrating that the same upheaval can produce resilience and growth in some, even as it crushes others. Her evolution implies that transformation, though often rooted in sorrow, can act as a catalyst for personal empowerment and discovery. It suggests that crisis doesn't always destroy. It can also reveal new paths to independence and selfhood. Kafka also links transformation to the act of creation itself, viewing artistic expression as a powerful tool for personal change. For him, writing became a means of probing alternate selves and deeper meanings. Through creative work, one steps outside their ordinary perspective, engaging with the world in unfamiliar and revelatory ways. Art, then, becomes a transformative experience, not just for the artist, but for the audience as well, inviting new modes of perception, empathy, and understanding. Kafka frequently blurs the boundary between the human and the animal, compelling us to reflect on what truly defines our humanity. When Gregor turns into a creature, he retains his emotional awareness and rational thought, even as his physical body and social identity are stripped away. This dichotomy forces the reader to ask whether our humanity is rooted in our physical form, our consciousness, our interpersonal bonds, or our ethical capacities. His transformation challenges us to distinguish between the core elements of human identity and those aspects that are circumstantial or imposed by society. The permanence of transformation in Kafka's stories echoes his view that once life has changed in a meaningful way, there's no return to the past. We cannot undo what we've learned, regain youth after growing old, or revert to ignorance after becoming aware. Each transformation signifies a definitive passage into a new mode of existence. Accepting these changes is essential to maintaining a coherent sense of self. Attempts to deny or escape them only deepen alienation and suffering. At its heart, Kafka's message is that transformation is not an occasional event, but a fundamental condition of life. Human existence is a continuous state of becoming, constantly shifting between who we were and who we are yet to become. Whether this ongoing change feels like a threat or a gift depends on how we respond to it. Rather than resisting change, Kafka urges us to face it with integrity and authenticity. The challenge is not to avoid transformation, but to navigate it while holding on to the essence of who we are. Part 13. The Inaccessibility of Truth and Knowledge. Franz Kafka held the view that truth lies beyond the reach of human understanding, not due to a lack of intellect or diligence, but because truth itself may not exist in a form that humans are capable of grasping or applying. His characters are driven by an urgent desire to make sense of their circumstances, yet their efforts to gain clarity are continually thwarted. As they delve deeper, posing questions, analyzing situations, and pursuing knowledge, they find themselves increasingly bewildered. This illustrates Kafka's belief that the very act of seeking knowledge is flawed, rooted in assumptions about reality that may be completely baseless. In his novel The Trial, Kafka suggests that falsehood is embedded into the fabric of legal systems. This doesn't merely point to institutional corruption, though that is certainly part of it, but rather it critiques the notion that formal systems can successfully codify or deliver truth. The institutionalization of truth inevitably distorts it, transforming it into something entirely different. What arises instead are mechanisms of propaganda, ideological constructs, or bureaucratic expediencies. Institutions crave order, uniformity, and control, but these desires are fundamentally at odds with the nuanced, fluid, and contradictory nature of real human existence. Kafka underscores this theme through storytelling methods that intentionally obscure essential information from both his protagonists and the reader. By keeping everyone in the dark, he teases the hope that answers might eventually emerge, while subtly making it clear that no such resolution will come. This literary strategy reflects the broader existential condition, the persistent search for meaning in a world that offers none, the yearning for answers where none exist. We, like Kafka's characters, anticipate that the pieces will eventually fall into place, that the riddles will resolve themselves. But instead, we're met with silence. The confusion and disappointment we experience as readers mirrors the human condition itself, a relentless quest for explanation in a universe that remains stubbornly mute. Nowhere is this crisis more visible than in the way Kafka's characters attempt to communicate. Language, which should serve to bridge gaps and foster understanding, frequently does the opposite. Instead of connecting people, it isolates them. Characters speak but are misunderstood, misread vital messages, or find that their expressions fail to match their intentions. Even when they share the same vocabulary, they often attach entirely different meanings to the same words, resulting in conversations that deepen confusion rather than dispel it. This failure of communication speaks to a more profound issue, The limitations of language as a medium for conveying truth. Words are inherently insufficient to capture the full richness of human thought, feeling, or experience. They resonate differently for each person, shaped by unique histories, cultures, and personal contexts. Every attempt to externalize internal experience through shared language inevitably leads to distortion, oversimplification, and the erosion of nuance, losses that cannot be undone. Kafka also anticipated that modern technology, despite its promises to enhance communication and democratize knowledge, would only intensify these challenges. Take the telephone, for instance. It presents an illusion of closeness while preserving actual emotional and physical distance. In Kafka's perspective, technological advances increase the frequency of communication without improving its substance. They raise expectations of precision and immediacy that reality cannot satisfy. Ironically, as our tools for communication grow more advanced, it becomes increasingly evident how impossible it is to truly understand or to be truly understood by another human being. Kafka's treatment of truth aligns with his deeper mistrust of reason and its supposed power to reveal the nature of existence. He saw the Enlightenment faith in rational inquiry and scientific progress as deeply misguided. What others hailed as a path to enlightenment, Kafka recognized as a delusion. It's possible that reason itself is no more than a human invention, no more inherently trustworthy than emotion or intuition when it comes to comprehending reality. While the tools of science, logic, and methodical inquiry may yield practical insights and technological advancements, they fall short of unlocking any absolute truths about the essence of existence. This deep-rooted skepticism about knowledge extends beyond empirical facts into the realms of morality and politics. Kafka's characters often find themselves unable to clearly distinguish between good and evil, justice and injustice, or legitimate versus corrupt power. The standards they might use to make such judgments are themselves fraught with uncertainty. These standards often rest on unverifiable assumptions and inherited customs, rather than on consciously chosen principles. Moral evaluation, ideally, depends on a foundation of shared values and mutual understanding. But in Kafka's world, these foundations reveal themselves to be arbitrary constructs, not revelations of objective moral truth. Likewise, the pursuit of self-understanding proves equally futile. Kafka's figures are incapable of grasping their own motives, desires, or authentic identities. They remain enigmas even to themselves, acting on impulses they cannot explain and chasing ambitions they struggle to define. This inner obscurity only deepens the difficulty of connecting with others. After all, how can we offer others what we ourselves do not possess? And yet Kafka does not suggest that the absence of absolute truth must lead to despair or nihilism. Instead, he implies that recognizing our inability to arrive at final answers might actually free us from the burden of needing certainty before we can make choices or take action. Accepting that ambiguity is a permanent feature of human life may allow us to live more honestly and with greater authenticity within that uncertainty. Under this view, the aim is no longer to secure ultimate truth, but to preserve personal integrity amid confusion and ignorance. This philosophical stance also encourages new approaches to understanding. Rather than fixating on definitive conclusions, we might turn our attention to formulating more insightful questions. Instead of craving certainty, we could learn to embrace ambiguity and accept provisional knowledge. Rather than waiting passively for truth to reveal itself, we take active responsibility for constructing meaning in our own lives. Kafka's portrayal of the unattainability of truth ultimately raises a deeper question. How should we live when we can never be entirely sure what is right or true? Such a condition calls for humility, for the courage to act in the face of uncertainty, and for the ability to tolerate not knowing. It also demands that we differentiate between the knowledge that serves practical ends and the metaphysical truths that may forever remain inaccessible. Perhaps, then, the pursuit of truth holds value not because it culminates in certainty, but because it keeps us intimately engaged with the richness, the ambiguity, and the profound mystery of existence. Part 14, Power and Powerlessness. In Kafka's universe, power functions through elusive and often unseen channels, making any attempt at resistance not only challenging, but frequently futile. Characters find themselves at the mercy of obscure forces, ruled by authorities that are nowhere to be found, and ensnared in systems whose regulations are either obscured or constantly shifting. Kafka conveys the idea that modern power no longer relies primarily on overt force. Instead, it is embedded in institutional frameworks that subtly shape how people think and behave. These structures present certain behaviors and ideas as natural or inevitable, while making other possibilities seem unimaginable or illegitimate. The most insidious forms of domination are those that are mistaken for personal autonomy or common sense, precisely because they are so deeply internalized. In Kafka's world, powerlessness is not merely a lack of status or official authority. It's a more profound inability to grasp one's circumstances well enough to act meaningfully. Take Joseph K. in the trial. He cannot properly defend himself because he is denied access to any clear explanation of the charges against him or the workings of the judicial system. This deliberate suppression of information makes resistance unfeasible. Without understanding the nature of their predicament, individuals cannot form realistic plans or assess their options. Information itself becomes a tightly regulated form of power, distributed along lines that reinforce existing hierarchies, benefiting those already in control while withholding it from those who need it most. Modern bureaucracies in Kafka's depiction further complicate matters by dispersing responsibility across vast, impersonal networks. Accountability becomes virtually impossible. When failures occur, no single person can be blamed. Everyone is merely implementing directives issued by someone else, perhaps long ago, under circumstances no longer relevant or clear. This scattering of accountability shields those who wield authority and abandons those subjected to it, leaving them with little means of redress when systems fail. Institutions begin to serve themselves rather than the people they were meant to assist. They become self-validating, resistant to both external scrutiny and internal change. Kafka emphasizes that power doesn't always operate through violence or overt threats. Instead, it manipulates essential human desires: security, belonging, achievement, love. These emotional levers prove more effective than punishment, as they persuade individuals to comply willingly. People often participate in their own oppression, believing it aligns with their personal goals or needs. This kind of voluntary subjugation presents a psychological barrier to resistance. To challenge such a system, individuals must first confront the painful truth that they were complicit in their own exploitation. This realization is often accompanied by guilt and shame, emotions that can suppress collective action more efficiently than any external force. The interplay between knowledge and power adds yet another layer of complexity. Those who control information frequently use it to maintain their dominance rather than to foster broader understanding or promote the public good. Professionals, experts, and technocrats cultivate specialized knowledge that renders them indispensable, while also making their work opaque and inaccessible to outsiders. Such technical specialization can be employed to uphold systems that serve elite or professional interests rather than the common welfare. It creates new societal divisions, no longer based on traditional wealth or lineage, but on access to expertise and educational credentials. Although the expansion of education is often seen as a way to level the playing field, it may paradoxically reinforce new hierarchies grounded in technocratic authority. Kafka also explores the spatial dimensions of power, particularly through the architectural and geographic design of institutions. His descriptions, whether of the elusive castle that K can never enter, the hidden courtrooms tucked away in cramped attics, or the endless bureaucratic corridors, illustrate how physical spaces can enforce and symbolize entrenched power structures. These settings not only reflect hierarchy, but actively contribute to its maintenance. Power manifests not only in abstract systems, but in the very design of physical space, determining who is allowed where and who remains unseen. Architecture plays a crucial role in reinforcing social stratification, shaping movement and visibility in ways that naturalize inequality and render alternative social orders difficult to conceive, let alone realize. The influence of power extends into time itself, shaping when things happen and who controls the clock. Those with authority dictate timelines, deadlines, and rhythms of work, prioritizing institutional agendas over individual needs. The ability to make others wait, to control access to critical opportunities, and to determine the timing of key events grants substantial influence over those subject to such imposed schedules. In modern society, time has been commodified. No longer simply a medium of living, it is treated as a tradable asset. This shift generates new inequalities, as some enjoy the freedom to manage their own time, while others are bound to schedules they cannot control. The accelerating pace of life tends to privilege those who thrive amid constant change, while disadvantaging those who require time to understand, adapt, or resist. Franz Kafka's work illustrates how power can absorb and neutralize dissent by allowing limited, managed forms of resistance. Institutions may tolerate superficial critique, offering symbolic gestures of opposition that diffuse dissatisfaction without challenging the system's foundations. What appears to be democratic engagement or open dialogue can, in fact, conceal the reality that decisions are made out of public reach by actors unaccountable to those affected. This co-optation of resistance complicates the struggle for real change. It blurs the line between genuine activism and performative gestures, between reforms that address structural problems and those that merely sustain the illusion of progress. As resistance becomes performative, meaningful opposition becomes harder to identify and enact. The psychological toll of prolonged powerlessness extends beyond the realms of politics and economics. It touches deeply on questions of agency and self-worth. When individuals repeatedly experience their inability to affect the conditions of their lives, they may internalize a sense of futility, a learned helplessness that blinds them to moments when real agency is, in fact, possible. Such internalized defeat can entrench itself, shaping people's expectations of what is possible. Over time, this psychological accommodation to subjugation sustains systems of domination by discouraging even the thought of resistance. Reclaiming true political and social agency, then, involves more than structural reform. It demands psychological recovery from the wounds of disempowerment. Nonetheless, Kafka also insists that power's reach is never absolute. Within the very complexity and contradictions of modern systems lie openings for real resistance. These systems are never seamless. They are filled with cracks that can be found and exploited by those who see them clearly and are willing to act despite the risks. While individual acts of defiance may appear insignificant in isolation, their cumulative effect, especially when echoed by others, can catalyze broader change. The aim is not to abolish all forms of authority, but to ensure that power remains in service to humanity, rather than reducing individuals to mere instruments within impersonal, dehumanizing institutions. Part 15. Freedom and Determinism. One of the most haunting and deeply philosophical themes running through Kafka's work is the clash between human freedom and the hidden forces that shape our existence. His characters often believe they are acting of their own volition, only to find themselves ensnared in circumstances they never consciously selected and cannot escape. This contradiction hints at the unsettling possibility that what we call freedom may be largely an illusion, a reassuring narrative we construct, even as unseen systems and pressures silently dictate our behavior. Yet the very sense of being confined or restricted points to an awareness of what true freedom might entail, revealing a constant inner conflict between our longing for self-determination and the boundaries that reality imposes. Kafka grasped how the rise of modern industrial civilization introduced new, more subtle forms of determinism. These influences, though less overt than past external constraints, can be even more powerful. Social expectations, economic demands, psychological influences, and institutional frameworks all work together to steer human behavior in certain directions. Meanwhile, they preserve the illusion that individuals are making independent choices. People may feel autonomous because they can select among available options, but these options are often pre-selected by systems outside their control, and frequently exclude the paths they would most genuinely desire. This curated version of freedom serves the needs of systems that depend on willing participation, while it quietly suppresses any truly radical alternatives. There is also a deeply psychological aspect to the interplay between freedom and determinism, especially in how our past shapes our present decisions. Kafka's characters repeatedly fall into behavior patterns formed by childhood experiences or earlier relationships. They find themselves reenacting old habits that no longer reflect their current needs or authentic selves. This kind of psychological determinism works beneath conscious awareness, through ingrained mechanisms that direct actions without being subject to rational scrutiny. While therapeutic insight and self-awareness offer the promise of increased autonomy, Kafka remains doubtful that understanding oneself is enough to break free from deeply embedded tendencies. Adding another layer to this complexity is the role of personality and temperament in shaping behavior. We like to believe our decisions express our true values and conscious will, but Kafka's stories expose how much of what we do seems driven by aspects of character and disposition that we never chose, and often fail to comprehend. This raises difficult questions. Are we accountable for actions that arise from traits we inherited rather than consciously developed? Does true freedom demand that we somehow overcome or transcend the very nature of who we are? Such questions suggest that our autonomy may be far more limited than we often assume, shaped by psychological structures that function below the surface of intentional thought. Social and cultural influences further complicate the issue. From a young age, we absorb values, norms, and behaviors through processes of socialization that precede any capacity for critical thought. These influences continue throughout our lives, reinforced by institutions, traditions, and peer dynamics. As a result, the beliefs and desires we take to be personal may in fact be reflections of cultural conditioning. The pursuit of authentic freedom, then, requires the difficult task of separating what genuinely belongs to us from what we have unconsciously inherited from our surroundings. Kafka also explores economic determinism, the way material necessity narrows human possibility. The basic need to survive forces individuals into jobs, roles, and economic relationships they might never choose under different circumstances. Financial pressure compels people to follow paths that often conflict with their personal growth or inner aspirations, revealing how the structure of the economy itself can limit freedom and shape lives in ways that feel inescapable. Economic coercion fosters a form of deep-rooted structural unfreedom, one that shapes not only moment-to-moment decisions, but also influences long-term planning and the development of personal identity. When meeting external economic demands becomes the foundation of one's basic security, the formation of genuine preferences and the pursuit of self-directed goals are often relegated to the background, possibly deferred indefinitely. Franz Kafka examines how institutional frameworks systematically restrict individual freedom while continuing to emphasize the ideals of personal agency and choice. Structures such as legal systems, educational bodies, healthcare providers, and governmental institutions impose procedural demands that subtly but powerfully narrow the spectrum of feasible actions, even as they present themselves as defenders of rights and promoters of the public good. These constraints are reinforced by an ever-growing network of rules and regulations that render certain behaviors practically unachievable, simultaneously steering individuals into narrowly defined roles or courses of action. The sheer intricacy of these institutional requirements often turns compliance into a near full-time endeavor, draining energy and attention from more authentic pursuits and stifling any serious challenge to the status quo. Questions of freedom and determinism also involve our temporal orientation, whether the future genuinely offers multiple paths or whether prevailing trends predetermine certain outcomes, regardless of personal decisions. Kafka's characters frequently experience a haunting sense of inevitability, as if they are propelled toward inescapable fates despite their awareness of and resistance to such trajectories. This feeling of being trapped by destiny may either reflect a clear understanding of the profound social and psychological forces that limit autonomy or signify a type of internalized helplessness that obscures real opportunities for meaningful decision-making. The real challenge lies in discerning whether one is rightly recognizing actual limitations or prematurely surrendering agency that could still be effectively exercised. At the same time, Kafka hints that neither complete determinism nor absolute freedom captures the full truth of human existence. Rather, our lives are shaped by an ongoing tension between constraining forces and the enduring possibility of authentic choice. Even in situations of extreme restriction, individuals retain the ability to choose their attitude, to interpret their experiences, and to find meaning within their circumstances. Though this freedom may appear limited in scope, its significance is profound. It embodies the irreducible essence of human dignity and moral agency. Ironically, the awareness that we cannot control most external events may deepen our appreciation for those areas where real choice still exists. Kafka's own artistic life illustrates this complex relationship with freedom. His writing was both a deliberate, autonomous act and an irresistible compulsion that seemed beyond his conscious control. Yet the creative impulse, despite its mysterious origins, stands as one of the purest expressions of human freedom, offering new perspectives and alternative interpretations of lived experience. This suggests that the essence of freedom may lie less in reshaping our circumstances and more in responding to them with creative authenticity. Rather than striving for total self-governance, the emphasis shifts toward discovering and exercising meaningful forms of agency within the inevitable constraints of human life. Kafka's philosophical reflections on freedom and determinism ultimately propose a nuanced view, one that avoids both the illusion of limitless freedom and the despair of absolute powerlessness. This balanced perspective calls for a clear-eyed evaluation of our real capabilities and boundaries, along with a determined commitment to making use of whatever authentic choices remain open to us. In this light, the true worth of freedom may not depend on how many options we have, but on how sincerely we engage with the ones that are available. Such a refined conception of freedom demands greater wisdom and resilience than unbounded liberty would, as it must be exercised without certainty and upheld in the face of continual doubt about its impact or importance. Part 16. The Grotesque and the Surreal. In Kafka's writing, grotesque and surreal elements are not fantastical diversions from reality. They are instead direct expressions of the concealed truths of modern life. These unsettling features expose the disturbing logic that underpins social existence, usually hidden beneath the surface of everyday interactions. When Gregor Samsa awakens to find himself transformed into a giant insect, when Joseph K. is arrested for a crime that is never disclosed, or when K is endlessly obstructed in his attempts to reach the castle, Kafka is not indulging in fantasy. Rather, he is revealing the actual dynamics of social systems that often remain invisible. The grotesque brings into sharp relief the dehumanization, randomness, and underlying absurdity that define institutional life. Reality is typically obscured by routines and social niceties. What appears surreal on the surface is, paradoxically, more honest than traditional realism. It strips away the illusions we cling to in order to shield ourselves from the strangeness and discomfort of our daily existence. Kafka's use of transformation, particularly the shift from human to non-human forms, reflects his perception that modern economic and social frameworks routinely reduce individuals to mere functions or categories. These systems value people not for their humanity, but for their utility. Gregor's metamorphosis into a monstrous insect is a literal rendering of how capitalism reduces workers to mechanical components within a larger industrial process. His family's cold response following his transformation only underscores that they had never truly seen him as a person, but rather as a provider. The grotesque change in his body reveals the emotional and social dehumanization that had long been present beneath the superficial warmth of family life. Kafka frequently employs animal imagery to underscore how humans are stripped down to biological or economic functions. The uniquely human qualities, creativity, ethical agency, spiritual aspiration, are ignored or actively repressed. People become animal-like not because of inherent savagery, but because society treats them as if their basic needs and instincts are all that define them. These grotesque metamorphoses represent the logical culmination of systemic forces that gradually erode personal dignity, reducing individuals to survival-driven beings. This process of dehumanization benefits institutions that prefer people to be predictable, controllable resources instead of self-directed, complex agents. The surreal manipulation of time and space in Kafka's narratives mirrors the lived reality of navigating institutional frameworks that follow their own opaque logic, often indifferent to human rhythms and needs. The endless hallways, obscure offices, and unreachable authorities are not dreamlike in the escapist sense. They are accurate portrayals of bureaucratic systems, mazes in which people are trapped without direction or support. Kafka's distortion of time, endless delays or sudden, inexplicable events, reflects how institutional time disregards the natural and psychological tempos of human life. These surreal features faithfully capture the disorientation of trying to live as a human being within structures that are fundamentally inhuman. Kafka's grotesque is often created by exaggerating everyday social patterns until their underlying truths become impossible to ignore. The extremity of Joseph K's situation in the trial exposes the arbitrary, self-perpetuating nature of legal systems. Similarly, the complete transformation of Gregor in the Metamorphosis exposes the transactional and conditional quality of familial affection. By pushing common experiences to their breaking point, Kafka forces us to confront what they truly entail when stripped of comforting habits, societal norms, and illusions. The grotesque in his work functions as a form of critique more incisive than conventional realism, because it reveals essential structures and truths that ordinary representation might gloss over. Kafka also explores the unsettling overlap between the grotesque and the comic. His stories often provoke a kind of uneasy laughter, laughter that mixes discomfort with recognition. The absurd predicaments faced by his characters are at once tragic and darkly humorous, compelling readers to empathize with their suffering while also perceiving the ridiculousness of human vanity and self-deception. The comedy in Kafka is never simple. It unsettles rather than amuses, deepening the impact of the grotesque rather than softening it. Kafka's use of dark humor does not function as a means of coping with serious issues. Instead, it heightens the sense of how bizarre and arbitrary the structures we take seriously actually are. The laughter his work elicits is often mixed with unease, as it confronts readers with unsettling truths about how we ourselves are entangled in absurd and irrational social systems. Kafka's surrealism often manifests through a collapse of expected cause and effect logic. His narratives unfold in worlds where actions lead to inexplicable consequences, or where outcomes appear entirely detached from any identifiable cause. This mirrors real-life experiences within complex modern systems, where individual efforts produce unpredictable results and merit rarely guarantees success. What initially seems fantastical in his stories is, in fact, a faithful depiction of the confusion and loss of control that characterize contemporary social and economic structures. In Kafka's work, the grotesque body functions as a metaphor for the psychological and physical disintegration brought on by modern life. Characters often experience their bodies as alien, malfunctioning, or repulsive, symbolizing a deeper alienation from biological rhythms and natural human processes. Kafka repeatedly focuses on illness, discomfort, and bodily transformations to highlight how modernity drives a wedge between body and mind, producing a fractured sense of self that affects even the most fundamental experiences of being human. The grotesque body becomes a literal battlefield where social pressures and internal conflicts are made visible and unavoidable. Kafka's portrayal of technology and machinery is frequently laced with surreal distortions that expose the oppressive nature of systems designed to assist humanity. In the penal colony, the execution device epitomizes a technological solution, So totalizing it erases the need for empathy, discretion, or human judgment. Its mechanical precision reveals a deeper, disturbing logic, one in which technical efficiency and bureaucratic ease override human dignity. This chilling portrayal underscores how supposedly rational systems can, in practice, become inhumane. The dreamlike atmosphere that saturates Kafka's narratives reflects his insight that, under modern conditions, the lines between conscious awareness and unconscious processes have become increasingly blurred. Characters often navigate their situations with the detached presence of sleepwalkers, while their buried anxieties and desires shape external events in ways that defy logical explanation. This fusion of inner and outer worlds suggests a profound interdependence between personal psychology and societal structures, one that cannot be neatly separated into subjective versus objective realities. Kafka's surrealism thus becomes a vehicle for conveying psychological truths that evade more straightforward, realist depictions. At its core, the grotesque and surreal elements in Kafka's writing serve a philosophical function. They strip the familiar of its normalcy, allowing readers to see everyday life in a new and often disturbing light. By presenting ordinary scenarios in distorted, unfamiliar forms, Kafka compels us to question what we typically accept without reflection. The grotesque, in this sense, becomes a critical tool, a method for disrupting the numbing effects of routine and social conformity, prompting a sharper awareness of our actual conditions. Rather than offering an escape from reality, Kafka uses these techniques to expose it more fully. His work aims to dismantle the comforting illusions that obscure genuine understanding and hinder meaningful responses to the complexities of modern existence. Part 17. Modern Life and Dehumanization. Kafka's portrayal of modern existence uncovers a systematic erosion of individuality, where people are reduced to components within vast, impersonal, bureaucratic, and mechanical systems. The optimistic belief that technological advancement and rational structures would enhance human life is ultimately exposed as largely illusory. Rather than liberating people, these modern developments have introduced more insidious and pervasive forms of alienation and control. These systems, while often less overtly oppressive than traditional forms of domination, nonetheless confine individuals to roles that prioritize efficiency and standardization over well-being and personal growth. This inversion, where systems once meant to serve humanity now dictate its shape, is so total that the artificial begins to seem natural. The needs of real human beings are cast as impractical or burdensome, while the demands of institutions are accepted as unchangeable facts. Throughout Kafka's work, human relationships are drained of spontaneity and warmth, shaped instead by formalized roles and procedural expectations. People increasingly engage with each other not as full, complex individuals, but as functions within a larger mechanism. Family members, colleagues, even romantic partners behave more like automatons than like beings with inner depth and emotional nuance. While this mechanization may offer predictability and smoother interactions, it comes at a profound cost: the erosion of creativity, intimacy, and authentic emotional connection. Even within seemingly close relationships, individuals feel isolated because they are connecting to roles rather than to real people. In this way, alienation thrives amidst surface-level interaction. Mass media, consumerism, and institutional routines further homogenize experience, discouraging individuality and marginalizing those who deviate from the norm. As society conditions people to desire the same things and express themselves through uniform channels, the richness of personal identity becomes a liability rather than a strength. This uniformity is essential for systems designed to manage vast populations, but it also flattens human experience into simplified categories. The modern celebration of individual choice often conceals a deeper conformity. What is offered is not genuine self-expression, but a limited set of pre-approved options that obscure the possibility of authentic personal development. The relentless speed of modern life adds another layer of harm. Constantly shifting demands require immediate reactions, quick decisions, and rapid adaptation, leaving little room for the reflection, deliberation, or gradual growth that true human flourishing demands. While this acceleration benefits economic structures built on constant innovation and turnover, it undermines the slower, more organic rhythms of emotional development, lasting relationships, and cultural creativity. In this way, time itself becomes weaponized, a force that fractures depth and stability, robbing people of the capacity for meaningful, sustained experience. At the same time, bureaucratic logic infiltrates nearly every domain of life, replacing personal judgment and communal values with standardized processes. Spheres that once relied on human discretion, education, healthcare, family life, even leisure, are now governed by administrative imperatives centered on regulation and control. As bureaucratic systems expand, people are recast. Citizens become service users. Students are treated as data points, and patients are reduced to diagnostic categories. The habit of following fixed procedures begins to dull the capacity for independent thought and nuanced response, leading individuals to defer to systems rather than respond to the specific demands of their circumstances. Finally, the commercialization of human activity strips experiences of their intrinsic meaning, reconfiguring them as marketable goods. Education is no longer pursued for personal growth, but is purchased as a tool for economic advancement. Healthcare is reframed not as a compassionate relationship, but as a transaction between providers and consumers. Even personal relationships and family life have come under the influence of market principles, where individuals assess emotional connections in terms of cost-benefit calculations, aiming to optimize their returns from social engagements. The disjointed nature of contemporary existence imposes unnatural separations between facets of human life that were once interconnected within a unified way of being. Professional responsibilities are increasingly detached from domestic life. Analytical reasoning is isolated from emotional awareness, and personal desires are often at odds with communal responsibilities. These divisions create inner conflicts, making it difficult to live in an authentic and integrated manner. People are forced to constantly transition between roles and environments that may demand opposing values or behaviors, resulting in fractured moral integrity and unstable personal identities. This compartmentalization benefits systems that rely on narrowly focused, specialized contributions, but it compromises the psychological unity and completeness that individuals need for mental health and a sense of fulfillment. Modern institutions possess far-reaching surveillance technologies, fostering conditions in which privacy and independent thinking are harder to preserve. People often adjust their actions not only when surveillance is confirmed, but even when it is merely suspected. This heightened state of self-awareness extends beyond behavior into the realm of thought. As individuals begin to regulate their inner lives to align with perceived external expectations. Over time, the internalization of surveillance fosters a form of self-regulation that surpasses the effectiveness of external oversight, functioning continuously without the need for institutional enforcement. The increasing complexity of today's societal systems makes it challenging for the average person to grasp how the structures that govern their lives truly function, or to envision alternative models. This intentional lack of transparency benefits those in power, as it obstructs informed critique and makes organized resistance harder to mount. When individuals are kept in the dark about how systems operate, they are less able to contest them or develop practical alternatives. This enforced ignorance becomes a tool of domination, reinforcing existing power dynamics and obstructing the kind of participatory democracy that could lead to more compassionate and equitable arrangements. The psychological consequences of dehumanization go far beyond economic or social dimensions, striking at the heart of human self-awareness and emotional depth. When people are persistently treated as mere instruments rather than full persons, they may begin to see themselves in diminished terms, questioning their own feelings, perceptions, and moral intuitions. This erosion of self can become a self-reinforcing cycle as individuals adjust to dehumanizing environments by adopting coping mechanisms that blunt their capacity for genuine emotional experience. Overcoming this damage demands more than just changes in external conditions. It requires deep psychological repair to undo the harm inflicted by prolonged dehumanization. However, as Kafka intimates, becoming conscious of these dehumanizing forces may serve as the first step toward opposing them and imagining more compassionate ways of living. When individuals begin to see how institutional systems erode their humanity, they may feel compelled to pursue relationships and practices that affirm their full human dignity. This process of resistance might originate with personal decisions about how to interact and engage with others, but real transformation ultimately depends on collective efforts to reshape institutions so that they nurture rather than reduce human potential. The objective is not to dismantle all organizational structures, but to ensure they support authentic personal growth and foster meaningful human-centered social connections. Part 18. Jewish Identity and Cultural Displacement. Franz Kafka's life as a German-speaking Jew in Prague placed him at a cultural crossroads, connected to several worlds yet fully belonging to none. This constant sense of in-betweenness shaped his deep sensitivity to themes of identity and alienation in the modern age. He occupied a unique position, a German speaker within a predominantly Czech society, a Jew in largely Christian Central Europe, and a progressive thinker raised in a traditional Jewish household. This layered sense of dislocation gave Kafka a rare perspective on the complexities of cultural identity in increasingly diverse societies, where long-standing traditions had fractured and no new, cohesive sense of belonging had emerged to replace them. His personal experience mirrored the broader Jewish history of exile and adaptation, which he used as a framework to explore the wider human condition of rootlessness and modernity. Kafka's connection to his Jewish roots and how this influenced his literature remains a subject of ongoing debate. While he largely avoided overtly Jewish topics or characters in his stories, scholars have identified underlying Jewish influences in his exploration of guilt, legal ambiguity, interpretation, and the pursuit of meaning within a seemingly meaningless world. The interpretive traditions of Jewish scholarship, emphasizing commentary, dialogue, and unresolved questioning, likely shaped Kafka's narrative style. His writing often resists final answers, instead embracing ambiguity and constant inquiry. This mirrors the Jewish experience of existing within but apart from dominant Christian society, a tension reflected in many of his characters who find themselves both subject to and alienated from the societal systems around them. Kafka's father, Hermann, embodied one response to modern Jewish identity: assimilation through economic advancement and the adoption of bourgeois norms. This meant reducing religious observance and downplaying distinct cultural traits, while maintaining primarily social and business ties within the Jewish community. Franz, however, found this path deeply unfulfilling, seeing it as a surrender of meaningful cultural identity in exchange for superficial inclusion in a society that still viewed Jews with suspicion and as fundamentally other. For Kafka, assimilation seemed to demand the erasure of Jewish distinctiveness without offering true acceptance. It led to a hollow integration, retaining neither the richness of Jewish tradition nor the promise of full belonging within the dominant culture. At different points in his life, Kafka was also drawn to Zionism and the dream of a Jewish national revival. He was intrigued by the idea of rebuilding a vibrant Jewish cultural life in Palestine, but remained critical of the nationalist project. For him, the attempt to normalize Jewish identity through the establishment of a Jewish state risked overlooking the value found in Jewish marginality and cultural distinctiveness. Kafka appeared to hold the view that the Jewish experience of being outsiders, of navigating blurred boundaries and enduring displacement, could offer profound insights into the broader condition of modern humanity. In his eyes, Jewish difference was not merely a problem to be solved through nationalism, but a lens through which the complexities of identity in the modern world could be better understood. Language further complicated Kafka's cultural identity. He wrote in German, not in Czech, Hebrew, or Yiddish, positioning himself within a language of prestige and literary refinement, but also within the linguistic domain of a dominant culture that often marginalized Jewish voices. German was at once the language of the artistic tradition he admired and of an elite class that reinforced exclusion. This choice symbolized a deeper conflict faced by many Jewish intellectuals in Central Europe, the struggle to reconcile cultural affiliation with authentic self-expression. While German gave Kafka access to a powerful literary heritage, it also raised questions about whether Jewish realities could truly be expressed in the language of those who had historically marginalized them. Kafka's portrayal of father-son dynamics echoes a distinctly Jewish generational tension, one rooted in the clash between religious tradition, cultural identity, and modern social adaptation. The friction between Hermann's pragmatic assimilation and Franz's intellectual and artistic sensibilities reflected the larger divide between conventional Jewish life and the secular modern world. Kafka wrestled with feelings of guilt for distancing himself from traditional Jewish practices, yet he found himself incapable of embracing them with sincerity. This internal conflict gave rise to the sense of spiritual homelessness that pervades much of his literary work, a profound and unresolved tension at the heart of his identity. This generational conflict encompassed more than just intimate family tensions. It also raised profound questions about preserving cultural identity in the face of rapid societal transformation. The recurring motifs of chosenness and exile in Jewish religious and cultural tradition reappear, reimagined throughout Kafka's work. His characters frequently perceive themselves as selected by obscure authorities for unusual treatment. For instance, Joseph K's inexplicable arrest mirrors the historical Jewish experience of being targeted for persecution without apparent cause or a clear path to defend oneself. This dual status, both chosen and marginalized, captures the complex, often contradictory place of Jews within Christian-dominated European societies. Kafka's work reflects a deep awareness of the double consciousness experienced by Jews, a simultaneous sense of inclusion and exclusion from the prevailing cultural framework. This internal conflict informed Kafka's sensitivity to broader modern experiences of alienation and cultural estrangement. Themes of guilt and moral obligation appear repeatedly in Kafka's fiction through characters who bear a deep sense of culpability without understanding its origin, often feeling responsible for events entirely beyond their control. These narratives emerge at the intersection of Christian notions of original sin and personal accountability with Jewish traditions of collective responsibility and historical memory. Together, they heighten the emotional weight of guilt and ethical obligation. Kafka's protagonists often perceive themselves as accountable not just for their own deeds, but for larger, systemic injustices and forms of suffering to which they may have been only passively connected. This expanded view of moral duty aligns with Jewish ethical teachings and reflects the lived reality of marginalized communities, negotiating their place within dominant cultural structures. The Jewish emphasis on interpretation and the search for meaning, central to its textual traditions, influenced Kafka's literary approach, shaping his stories as inquiries rather than answers. Rooted in a heritage of dialogue, commentary, and debate around sacred texts, Jewish intellectual tradition favors a multiplicity of interpretations over singular, fixed meanings. This heritage likely informed Kafka's inclination toward narratives that remain deliberately unresolved, inviting ongoing reinterpretation rather than offering final conclusions. The indeterminacy of Kafka's fiction mirrors the open-ended quality of Jewish scriptural analysis, where the richness of a text lies in its ability to provoke endless engagement. Kafka's exploration of Jewish identity reaches far beyond questions of ethnicity or religion. It addresses broader issues of cultural belonging within increasingly diverse and fluid societies. The Jewish experience of being culturally uprooted and crossing boundaries foreshadowed similar patterns that have become widespread in the modern world, where traditional borders and identities are increasingly permeable. The psychological strain and creative potential that Kafka derived from his multicultural position reflect challenges that many individuals now confront in constructing and maintaining hybrid cultural identities. His portrayal of Jewish marginalization offers valuable insight into how displacement can become a fertile ground for creativity, or a source of profound internal struggle. Whether such experiences result in personal growth or psychological distress depends largely on how individuals and societies engage with the complexities of multicultural life. Part 19. Art in the Creative Process. For Kafka, the act of writing was both a form of redemption and a source of profound inner conflict. It offered a channel for genuine self-expression, yet simultaneously exposed the fundamental limitations of language in conveying truth or producing lasting meaning. He likened writing to a kind of prayer, suggesting that the creative act fulfilled spiritual and psychological needs that traditional religion or societal engagement could not satisfy. However, this prayer often went unheard. Kafka frequently felt that his creative efforts ended in failure or incompletion, exacerbating rather than alleviating his existential anxiety. The very practice that promised depth and connection often heightened his awareness of isolation and underscored the futility of fully sharing one's inner world with others. Kafka's life was marked by a continual struggle to balance the demands of artistic creation with the expectations of ordinary existence. Writing required intense focus, solitude, and emotional commitment, conditions that often clashed with the practical necessities of earning a living, maintaining relationships, and fulfilling social duties. This tension was not merely logistical, it reflected a deeper psychological and philosophical divide between the creative self and the social persona required for daily functioning. The autonomy and inner freedom essential for artistic work frequently came at the cost of emotional security, connection, and recognition, needs that creative expression alone could not entirely fulfill. Kafka's narrative style was shaped by his belief that truth is elusive and cannot be conveyed directly. Instead, it must be approached obliquely, through symbols, metaphor, and experiences that compel the reader to interpret and reflect. His stories defy simplistic moralizing or clear resolutions, instead constructing unsettling scenarios that challenge readers to engage with profound questions about meaning, responsibility, and human existence. This indirect mode of expression stems from Kafka's conviction that authentic insight cannot be handed down as fact. It must emerge from the reader's personal engagement with complexity and ambiguity. For Kafka, the role of art is not to supply definitive answers, but to foster a space for inquiry, where genuine understanding might arise through introspection and interpretation. The unfinished, fragmentary nature of much of Kafka's work reflects both the practical constraints of his life and a deeper philosophical attitude toward the act of creation. His demanding job and chronic health issues left him with limited energy for sustained literary output. Yet the incompleteness of his major works also suggests a deliberate hesitation, a belief that no artistic endeavor can ever fully encapsulate the multifaceted nature of human life. To attempt a final, polished statement might risk betraying the open-ended, uncertain nature of existence. By leaving his texts unresolved, Kafka preserved their potential to invite continuous reinterpretation rather than closing them off with tidy conclusions. Themes of artistic inadequacy and failure recur throughout Kafka's writing, particularly in his depictions of characters who strive to communicate or create but find themselves misunderstood, dismissed, or actively thwarted. The hunger artist, who starves himself as a form of expression, ultimately discovers that his audience has grown indifferent to his sacrifice and dedication. Other figures, like trapeze artists and performers, embody the broader predicament of the artist, reliant on public attention, yet alienated from audiences increasingly unwilling or unable to engage with their work. Kafka uses these characters to explore not only personal alienation, but also the deeper question of whether art can retain its relevance and function in a society that struggles to recognize its value. Kafka also recognized that artistic creation arises from a complex interplay between conscious intention and unconscious forces. Some of the most impactful elements of his writing emerged not from deliberate planning, but from unpredictable, intuitive depths. In this way, the artist becomes not just the creator, but also the vessel through which the work manifests. This inherent unpredictability generates both exhilaration and fear. Artists cannot will inspiration into existence, nor can they be assured that their efforts will result in something meaningful, because the creative process depends so heavily on unconscious and uncontrollable elements. It remains a deeply uncertain endeavor, always subject to the whims of forces beyond the artist's command. Kafka's work illustrates a profound connection between artistic creation and the inner workings of personal psychology. His writing arises from deep-seated emotional conflicts and mental struggles, acting as both a product of these tensions and a potential path toward their transformation. While writing allowed Kafka to confront his anxieties and obsessive thoughts, the act of sustained creative focus also risked magnifying these inner disturbances by compelling him to dwell intensely on difficult experiences. The healing potential of artistic expression must therefore be understood in a nuanced way. Creative work may offer a route to psychological insight or relief, yet it also carries the danger of exacerbating the very issues it seeks to explore. In this dual role, art becomes both a manifestation of psychological distress and a possible avenue for transcending it through imaginative expression. Kafka's portrayal of the artist's relationship with society brings into focus the broader conflict between individual creative freedom and the pressures of social conformity, a tension deeply rooted in the cultural landscape of modernity. Artists often rely on societal recognition and support to sustain their creative pursuits. At the same time, they must retain a measure of independence from collective norms and commercial expectations that could compromise their artistic vision. This dynamic gives rise to ongoing conflicts. How can an artist maintain fidelity to their inner truth while also achieving the practical success required to continue working? In modern society, where culture is increasingly commercialized, this challenge becomes even more pronounced. The artistic process is subjected to economic forces that often disregard the intrinsic aesthetic or spiritual value of creative expression. Kafka's own ambivalence about artistic legacy is evident in his request that his major writings be destroyed after his death. This act reflects more than personal humility. It reveals a deeper concern about the fate of artistic meaning once it becomes detached from the living context of its creation. When intimate acts of creation are transformed into cultural artifacts, commodities for academic scrutiny, or commercial consumption, the original spirit and intent of the work may be compromised. Nonetheless, the preservation of Kafka's writings in defiance of his wishes points to another truth. Once a creative work enters the world, it can take on an independent life. Artistic expression, while born from a singular perspective, often continues to generate meaning in new contexts and for future audiences, far beyond the intentions of its creator. Kafka's unique artistic power lies in his ability to convert intensely personal, psychological, and cultural experiences into narratives that resonate on a universal level. His particular identity as a Central European Jew becomes a powerful lens through which timeless questions of alienation, identity, and the human search for meaning are explored. Rather than addressing universal themes directly, Kafka's work shows that the most profound insights often emerge from deep engagement with the specific and the personal. Authenticity in art, then, arises not from abstraction, but from immersion in the lived realities of one's individual and cultural circumstances. Paradoxically, it is through these intimate and localized experiences that artists are able to speak to the broader human condition. The philosophical depth of Kafka's artistic method lies in his demonstration that literature can function as a form of existential inquiry. Through fiction, he explores fundamental questions about meaning, morality, and existence, not by presenting abstract arguments, but by engaging the imagination in ways that reason alone cannot replicate. Artistic creation generates a form of experiential knowledge that complements, and at times challenges, the limits of intellectual analysis. The value of such creative inquiry is not in offering definitive answers to life's most difficult questions. Instead, its power lies in sustaining those questions, keeping them alive in the consciousness of the reader. Art resists the urge for closure and easy solutions. instead cultivating a persistent engagement with the complexity, uncertainty, and mystery that define human experience. In doing so, art serves truth, not by resolving it, but by remaining faithfully open to it. Part 20. Sexuality and Desire. Kafka portrays sexuality as a domain fraught with disappointment, miscommunication, and the inability to form genuine bonds or find lasting fulfillment. While desire draws individuals toward one another, these connections are frequently rooted in illusion, manipulation, or the projection of hidden emotional needs rather than true mutual understanding. Characters in Kafka's fiction often pursue love and physical intimacy as a way to escape from solitude and existential emptiness. However, instead of delivering the closeness and purpose they yearn for, sexual relationships often generate new layers of confusion and estrangement. The hope that erotic connection will lead to authentic human experience is consistently met with disillusionment. A recurring theme in Kafka's work is the intersection of power and sexuality, reflecting his insight that erotic interactions are not immune to the overarching structures of dominance and submission present in broader social systems. Sexual longing leaves individuals exposed to exploitation, as others may manipulate this vulnerability to gain emotional leverage or tangible benefits. At the same time, those who possess sexual allure or can offer physical satisfaction often wield a subtle form of power capable of influencing others regardless of whether sincere emotional connection is present. What is typically considered a private, personal sphere becomes enmeshed with societal concerns about hierarchy, authority, and the distribution of privilege. In the trial, sexuality is repeatedly depicted in scenarios involving the misuse of authority and the erosion of justice. Women connected to the legal system use their physical appeal to extract favors or privileged access to information, while male officials leverage their institutional positions to solicit sexual compliance from women seeking help. These dynamics expose how supposedly impartial bureaucratic processes are tainted by private desires and ulterior motives. Kafka uses these sexual transactions to reveal how personal appetites can infiltrate institutional power, cloaked under the guise of official duty. The result is a system where public authority serves private interest, undermining the integrity of justice and governance. Themes of sexual shame and humiliation are woven throughout Kafka's treatment of intimacy, underscoring how sexual exposure, both emotional and physical, renders individuals susceptible to rejection, ridicule, and deep psychological harm. The vulnerability intrinsic to erotic encounters opens the door to emotional wounds that may linger and shape behavior long afterward. Those who seek emotional connection and validation through sex often end up more isolated and wounded than before. The very force of erotic longing, which seems to promise an escape from loneliness, instead becomes a new source of pain when relationships fail to deliver the meaning they seem to offer. Kafka also critiques the commodification of sexuality as symptomatic of how modern capitalist structures reduce human relationships to economic transactions. Physical beauty and sexual appeal become assets, objects to be exchanged, marketed, or exploited for career advancement, social mobility, or material gain, rather than expressions of sincere affection or passion. This commodification undermines the possibility of genuine intimacy, as individuals can no longer be sure whether they are loved for who they are or for their utility in achieving non-erotic objectives. The logic of the marketplace infiltrates personal relationships, making honesty and emotional authenticity harder to sustain. Marriage and family life in Kafka's fiction often illustrate how institutions regulate and confine sexual desire, prioritizing societal order over personal happiness. Legal and economic factors, such as property rights, inheritance laws, and social prestige, dictate the shape of intimate relationships, often disregarding the emotional or physical needs of those involved. Spontaneous desire, which might naturally fade or change, becomes trapped in permanent legal arrangements that persist long after the original attraction has disappeared. This institutionalization of sexuality imposes new burdens and resentments, ultimately corrupting the very relationships it is meant to preserve and support. The interplay between sexuality and creativity in Kafka's life and writings emerges as both a catalyst for inspiration and a source of inner conflict. Erotic longing served as fertile ground for artistic expression, yet it also introduced emotional entanglements that disrupted the consistency and focus required for sustained creative efforts. The same intensity that underpinned sexual desire and romantic fixation was intimately tied to the force behind Kafka's literary output. Balancing these two potent energies proved difficult, as Kafka often found himself torn between emotional intimacy and the solitude essential to his craft. His relationships with women were marked by a recurring tension. The desire for closeness clashed with his deep need for independence and creative isolation. Kafka's exploration of themes such as sexual taboo and forbidden longing reflects his awareness of how sexuality often stirs desires that run counter to both societal expectations and personal ethical beliefs. His characters are frequently attracted to individuals or behaviors they know to be inappropriate or harmful, illustrating the persistent struggle between instinctual urges and moral reasoning. This internal conflict fractures the self, complicating not only decisive action, but also the pursuit of genuine self-understanding. Such psychological tension stems from the disparity between what individuals truly desire and what they believe they ought to desire. This dissonance becomes a persistent source of inner turmoil and moral ambiguity. The recurring failure of sexual relationships to deliver enduring meaning or contentment mirrors a broader theme in Kafka's body of work: the elusive nature of permanent solutions to the fundamental problems of existence. Like other fleeting gratifications, sexual satisfaction is impermanent and incomplete, demanding constant renewal and falling short of the profound connection and relief from isolation that one might hope it provides. This perspective does not suggest that sexuality is meaningless or that erotic involvement should be rejected altogether. Rather, it invites a more grounded understanding of what such relationships can realistically offer. The emphasis shifts from chasing idealized notions of sexual completeness to nurturing authentic bonds, all while accepting the inevitable frustrations and imperfections inherent in intimate human connections. Still, Kafka implies that sexuality, precisely because it entails risk, exposure, and emotional openness, can serve as a rare gateway to real human connection. The raw intensity of sexual desire has the power to pierce the defenses and conventions that typically keep individuals at a distance from one another. Even if these relationships do not lead to lasting joy, they may provide fleeting yet profound moments of mutual recognition and emotional truth. The true worth of sexuality may lie less in its capacity to resolve existential dilemmas and more in its potential to deliver episodes of emotional depth and heightened experience. Moments that, though transient, render life more bearable and, at times, deeply meaningful. Part 21. Work and Economic Life. In Kafka's writings, work often emerges as a space of deep-seated alienation, where individuals are reduced to mere cogs in vast, opaque systems they neither grasp nor influence. The characters frequently occupy roles that feel monotonous and devoid of significance, contributing to organizational objectives that remain obscure. Their daily responsibilities offer no inherent satisfaction, nor do they foster a sense of meaning or purpose. The necessity to earn a living stands in sharp contrast to the human desire for creativity, autonomy, and meaningful interaction with the world. This tension generates a rift between the realm of labor and the realm of authentic experience, fragmenting the individual's life and making it difficult, if not impossible, to develop a coherent and unified sense of self. Gregor Samsa's job as a traveling salesman illustrates the alienation embedded in modern labor systems. His work epitomizes how employees become replaceable components within an economic structure that values productivity over individuality. Trapped in a position he detests, Gregor is unable to quit because his family's financial well-being depends entirely on his income. The job itself demands no creativity or personal investment, only the repetitive completion of tasks that anyone with basic training could perform. This sense of being easily replaceable erodes a worker's sense of self-worth. Employees become valuable only in terms of their ability to fulfill specific roles, not for their unique qualities or human potential. The mechanization and depersonalization of labor make workers feel disposable and unimportant. The conversion of labor into a market commodity, something bought and sold like any other product, produces far-reaching psychological consequences. When survival depends on selling one's time and energy, people begin to define themselves through an economic lens, evaluating their personal worth based on income and marketability. This commodification undermines the ability to maintain a sense of dignity that is independent of one's economic output. Those unable to find employment or whose labor is poorly compensated often struggle to feel valued or respected, both socially and personally. The internalization of economic criteria as measures of self-worth leaves individuals vulnerable to feelings of inadequacy when they fall short of those standards. Modern bureaucracies intensify the alienation of work through the imposition of endless administrative tasks and procedural formalities. Employees find themselves burdened with paperwork, meetings, and compliance checks that seem more focused on maintaining hierarchical control than achieving any meaningful outcome. In many cases, bureaucratic systems prioritize efficiency over effectiveness, frustrating workers whose time and energy are squandered on tasks with no apparent value. Activities that could hold meaning or purpose are hollowed out by rigid rules and redundant protocols, sapping motivation and enthusiasm. Kafka's own career in the insurance industry gave him first-hand exposure to the soul-deadening aspects of institutional employment. His work, evaluating accident claims and compiling reports, served a social function but offered little in the way of personal fulfillment. This daily routine stood in stark contrast to his nighttime dedication to literature, which he viewed as his true calling. The disparity between his obligatory profession and his creative aspirations mirrors the experience of many individuals in modern life, who must juggle economic survival with a yearning for self-expression. The demands of his day job drain the time and energy needed for artistic creation, leaving him caught in a persistent conflict between external obligation and internal vocation. Work also complicates personal identity when people derive their self-definition primarily from their professional roles. Losing a job or being unable to work can trigger crises that extend well beyond financial hardship, shaking an individual's sense of purpose and societal relevance. On the other hand, even those who achieve success in their careers may discover that professional accolades fail to deliver the fulfillment they had anticipated. This can lead to a painful reckoning, as individuals question whether their life's efforts were directed toward hollow or misguided aims. In a culture where personal value is often equated with career achievement, people become especially susceptible to identity crises when their employment status shifts. The modern fixation on productivity and professional success leaves little room for alternative sources of meaning. Finally, the way contemporary work is structured in time brings its own set of problems. The division between work hours and personal time fragments daily life, preventing the development of a unified and meaningful experience. This separation of temporal realms reinforces the disconnection between one's economic role and one's true self, making it even harder to live an integrated, authentic life. Many people spend most of their waking lives engaged in pursuits they find meaningless, reserving their true selves for fleeting moments of free time that are rarely long or deep enough to offer real satisfaction. This sense of being out of sync with one's time is part of a larger condition of alienation that makes contemporary existence feel disjointed and lacking in coherence or purpose. The need to secure employment often pushes individuals to compromise their core values and personal desires in ways that erode their sense of integrity. People may find themselves contributing to systems or engaging in work they view as ethically troubling or socially damaging, simply because financial necessity leaves them no real choice. In such cases, true moral agency becomes nearly impossible. Over time, this pressure can foster a resigned attitude in which ethical concessions are seen not as unfortunate exceptions, but as unavoidable aspects of adult life. The imperative to survive financially often outweighs the desire to act with moral consistency, leading to deep internal tensions that defy easy resolution. Kafka's portrayal of technological advancement offers a sobering counterpoint to optimistic visions of progress. Rather than liberating individuals from the burdens of labor, modern technologies often increase surveillance and control in the workplace, thereby diminishing privacy and autonomy. Although machines may streamline specific tasks, they frequently usher in new demands for speed and output, without a corresponding increase in freedom or downtime. Instead of reducing work hours or expanding leisure, technological efficiency tends to raise performance expectations. In this way, technology becomes a mechanism for intensifying rather than alleviating the alienation and stress that mark contemporary work life. The alienation experienced in the workplace is also shaped by class structures that permeate broader social hierarchies. Those whose labor is primarily physical or manual typically enjoy less independence and receive less social respect than those engaged in intellectual or creative fields. These occupational divisions reinforce hierarchies of social value. Such disparities influence not just economic compensation, but also the sense of self-worth and public recognition that individuals receive. The cultural devaluation of manual labor, coupled with the idealization of mental work, reflects a narrow view of human potential that overlooks the richness of diverse contributions. Yet Kafka hints at a path toward meaning and authenticity, even within the confines of economic obligation. The crucial step is to resist equating personal identity with professional function, to see work as something we perform, not something that defines us. This perspective calls for cultivating sources of meaning, purpose, and identity outside of career achievements. The aim is not to discard the need for economically productive labor, but to ensure that it does not consume or suppress the full spectrum of human values and experiences. Real fulfillment requires maintaining space for aspects of life that are not measured by productivity or professional success. Part 22. The Individual versus Society. Franz Kafka's work is deeply infused with a persistent struggle between personal authenticity and societal conformity. He illustrates how modern social systems exert continuous pressure on individuals to abandon their true identities in favor of socially constructed facades deemed acceptable by the collective. Characters in his narratives often find themselves torn between preserving their inner sense of self and the pragmatic need to adopt roles that align with societal demands. This tension is not portrayed as incidental or temporary. It is inherent in the very design of modern institutions, which depend on standardized behavior and predictable responses, despite the intricate and often chaotic nature of human consciousness. This dynamic results in a profound sense of alienation, where people increasingly see themselves not as genuine individuals, but as performers acting out pre-assigned roles. In Kafka's portrayal, society functions as an impersonal machine that processes people through rigid classifications and impersonal systems. Human beings are not treated as unique individuals with particular needs and potential, but rather as cases to be managed, problems to be solved, or resources to be optimized. This mechanized treatment of human relationships erodes the possibility of genuine understanding and authentic human connection. At the core of this social machinery is the treatment of individuals as abstractions, types rather than persons. Bureaucratic systems, which pride themselves on efficiency, operate by reducing people to interchangeable units, only valuing personal traits in relation to task performance or productivity. Conformity is instilled from an early age, particularly through educational systems that reward obedience and penalize deviation. Children are taught to stifle their inherent curiosity and creative impulses in favor of behaviors that align with the expectations of authority figures, such as teachers and parents. This early indoctrination molds their personalities in ways that make genuine self-expression and later resistance to societal norms increasingly difficult. Even in environments where external pressures lessen, the deeply internalized norms continue to exert control. Individuals experience a persistent conflict between their authentic desires and the socially conditioned beliefs about what they should want. This creates a fractured consciousness, undermining the possibility of acting in ways that are truly self-directed. Economic systems provide another powerful lever of social control, compelling conformity by tying basic survival to compliance with prevailing norms around work, consumption, and participation. Those who cannot, or choose not to, fit into these predefined molds often find themselves economically marginalized or excluded altogether. This economic pressure proves even more insidious than overt political repression because it presents itself as a set of choices while actually offering only narrowly constrained options. The illusion of freedom makes it harder to recognize the structural forces at play, leading individuals to internalize blame for their dissatisfaction rather than questioning the system itself. Beyond their official mandates, social institutions also shape how people understand themselves by defining norms around what is considered normal, desirable, or healthy. Institutions such as medicine, law, education, and religion do not merely regulate outward behavior. They also assert authority over inner life, establishing accepted boundaries for thought, emotion, and desire. This institutional control over consciousness blurs the line between internal preference and external imposition. People often believe they are pursuing their own goals or upholding personal values, when in reality they are embodying socially imposed ideals, adopted so seamlessly that they feel entirely self-generated. While social roles such as worker, parent, citizen, or consumer provide structure and facilitate coordination, they also restrict self-expression. These roles impose fixed behavioral expectations that often leave little room for the spontaneous or the genuine, confining individuals to prescripted identities that may not reflect their inner truth. Individuals often find themselves confined within roles that no longer align with their evolving self-perception, yet feel powerless to break free. This paralysis stems from the fact that their sense of identity and social belonging is deeply intertwined with routines they've long maintained. In complex modern societies where the number of social roles continues to grow, this challenge is amplified. People must navigate a maze of overlapping and at times contradictory expectations, all while attempting to form a cohesive and stable sense of self. Franz Kafka illustrates that mechanisms of social control rely not so much on overt force or coercion, but rather on the subtler tools of shame, guilt, and the deep human need to belong. Individuals internalize societal standards, judging themselves by external benchmarks and thereby becoming their own most effective regulators. This internalized surveillance makes resistance especially difficult. Because it is woven into the very fabric of identity, submission often feels like personal volition rather than social pressure. The genius of this control lies in persuading individuals to participate willingly in their own subjugation and diminishment. Kafka's critique of individualism reveals it to be largely a mirage. What appears to be personal choice is frequently molded by invisible social currents. Consumer culture, for instance, presents an illusion of freedom by offering choices that have already been curated to serve institutional goals rather than individual fulfillment. Similarly, democratic political systems may promise agency, but often restrict participation within rigid institutional frameworks that hinder genuine transformation. The ideology of individualism can, paradoxically, serve to legitimize and obscure newer, more sophisticated forms of conformity. Yet Kafka also leaves room for a more hopeful possibility. Authentic individuality can still be achieved, but only by those prepared to endure the costs, social alienation, and economic vulnerability. Such integrity demands a strong internal compass, one that does not rely on external affirmation. It also requires the discernment to tell the difference between social obligations that warrant respect and arbitrary norms that can and should be disregarded. In this way, the pursuit of genuine selfhood becomes a subtle act of defiance against systems that seek to mold people into predictable, manageable roles. The interplay between authenticity and social responsibility is fraught with tension and cannot be reduced to simplistic ideologies or universal rules. People do have real responsibilities toward others, which at times may require the surrender of personal desires. At the same time, They bear responsibility for nurturing their own authentic humanity. This dual obligation means learning when to comply and when to resist, even if resistance leads to social rejection. Such judgment cannot be predetermined. It must emerge from an ongoing, thoughtful engagement with the particularities of each situation. In Kafka's vision, the ultimate goal is not to abolish social systems or to attain complete personal autonomy, but to create conditions where individuals can truly choose how to engage with social norms and institutional pressures. This demands not only that society become more accommodating of personal differences, but also that individuals cultivate greater self-awareness and resilience. The aspiration is not a final resolution of the tension between self and society, but a dynamic equilibrium, a balance that acknowledges this conflict as an enduring feature of the human condition. The value lies not in eradicating the tension, but in managing it creatively and constructively, so that it strengthens rather than undermines both personal authenticity and collective cohesion. Part 23. Anxiety and Existential Dread. In Franz Kafka's work, anxiety does not arise from identifiable threats or concrete dangers. Rather, it stems from a deeper, more pervasive unease rooted in the fundamental conditions of human existence. This existential dread is not something that can be alleviated by increasing safety or removing external risks, because it originates in our awareness of mortality, the burden of freedom, and the absence of absolute meaning or direction in life. Kafka's characters frequently display a constant undercurrent of apprehension, even when their external environment poses no immediate threat. This persistent unease points to anxiety as an intrinsic part of human consciousness, a built-in element of our condition, rather than a fleeting response to particular events or dangers that can be easily managed or resolved. The root of this anxiety lies in the uniquely human trait of self-awareness. Unlike animals that react instinctively to their surroundings, human beings must navigate the weight of knowing that we are finite, that we possess radical freedom, and that we alone are responsible for shaping the meaning of our lives. This awareness compels us to consider the consequences of our past actions and future possibilities, generating a continuous sense of uncertainty about our identity and purpose. This temporal self-consciousness prevents us from simply existing in the present. We are always entangled in reflections on our past and projections into the future, dimensions of time we can neither fully grasp nor control. This persistent engagement with our own timeline creates a background anxiety that seeps into all aspects of experience, subtly influencing our thoughts, emotions, and interactions. Kafka often portrays this anxiety as something that is not just mental or emotional, but also bodily. His characters frequently suffer from physical symptoms, tension, restlessness, and somatic discomfort, underscoring the idea that existential distress permeates the entire person. It is not confined to abstract thought or philosophical reflection, but is instead felt at the most visceral levels of being. This challenges the traditional Western philosophical divide between mind and body. In Kafka's universe, the boundary between the two collapses, revealing that our existential dilemmas are embedded in our physical experience. Intellectual reasoning cannot resolve this kind of anxiety because it emerges from layers of the psyche that lie beneath rational consciousness. Kafka also explores the way societal structures amplify personal anxiety. In the modern world, individuals face heightened existential distress due to the weakening of communal and religious frameworks that once offered guidance and meaning. While modern societies may grant more personal freedom, they often lack the shared values and cultural tools that once helped people navigate life's deepest questions. Traditional communities typically provided religious narratives, stable roles, and communal support, offering individuals ready-made answers to existential concerns. In contrast, contemporary secular, individualistic cultures place the burden of meaning-making entirely on the individual. With fewer external anchors, people must face anxiety and uncertainty alone, without reliable institutional or cultural scaffolding to support them. Throughout Kafka's writing, anxiety and guilt appear closely linked. He examines how the realization of total freedom and moral responsibility can lead to an overwhelming fear of making the wrong choice. This fear can be so paralyzing that it prevents action altogether, trapping individuals in a state of chronic self-doubt and inner scrutiny. In many cases, the fear of failing to be morally adequate becomes more oppressive than any actual wrongdoing. It fuels an internal regime of self-surveillance and perfectionism, where the pursuit of flawless behavior only heightens awareness of one's inevitable shortcomings. Instead of freeing the individual from guilt, this pursuit deepens the anxiety it seeks to eliminate. Kafka also illustrates how institutional systems can weaponize this existential anxiety to reinforce control. In the trial, for instance, the legal system manipulates Joseph K. by keeping him in a continuous state of confusion and apprehension. He is never given clear information or direction, but is constantly made to feel that inaction or missteps could worsen his situation. By sustaining this atmosphere of uncertainty, institutions like the court and the trial create dependency and compliance. People become so consumed by managing their emotional turmoil that they stop questioning the legitimacy of the very systems generating that distress. In this way, anxiety is transformed into a tool of control, allowing authority to operate without transparency, justification, or accountability. Anxiety possesses a unique relationship to time, where the present becomes overshadowed by apprehensions about the future and regrets from the past. Individuals suffering from anxiety struggle to remain grounded in the here and now, as their minds are continually preoccupied with imagining potential catastrophes ahead or revisiting prior missteps that seem, in hindsight, preventable. This temporal misalignment compromises one's ability to engage effectively with the reality of the present moment. Instead of responding to actual situations, anxious individuals devote their energy and focus to hypothetical scenarios. Ironically, this fixation on future fears often inhibits the kind of mindful awareness and decisive action that could positively shape what lies ahead. Franz Kafka examines how anxiety can perpetuate itself through intricate defense mechanisms that, rather than resolving the issue, intensify it. People often adopt complex avoidance strategies in an attempt to steer clear of anxiety-inducing situations. However, these very strategies tend to generate fresh constraints and forms of suffering. In trying to master anxiety by tightly controlling external circumstances, individuals end up trapping themselves in narrow, rigid patterns of behavior. These self-imposed constraints may offer temporary relief, but ultimately, they create a deeper sense of confinement. The pursuit of total control becomes a kind of prison where freedom, flexibility, and spontaneity are sacrificed in the futile effort to establish absolute security and predictability. In this way, the solution can grow more damaging than the original issue itself. Nevertheless, Kafka hints at a more nuanced understanding of anxiety, one where it is not merely a disorder to be eradicated, but a meaningful signal worth exploring. Existential anxiety, in particular, may point to real, pressing concerns, signs of responsibilities and possibilities that we have been reluctant to face. The task, then, is not to eradicate anxiety entirely, but to discern between the kinds that are destructive and those that are instructive. To do this, we must cultivate the capacity to endure uncertainty and discomfort. Avoiding all sources of anxiety in pursuit of superficial peace often leads to stagnation. Instead, learning to recognize when anxiety reflects unresolved inner truths allows for more intentional and necessary actions. Kafka's own creative life demonstrates the dual role anxiety can play, as both a fertile ground for artistic expression and a barrier to consistent creative output. His heightened sensitivity to existential issues offered a deep well of inspiration for his writing. Yet this same sensitivity often overwhelmed him, impairing his ability to function in everyday professional and social environments. This dynamic suggests that anxiety may be an inherent cost of heightened awareness. Those who remain fully attuned to the ambiguity and precariousness of human life may be especially prone to anxiety, not as a flaw, but as a reflection of their conscious engagement with existence. Kafka's reflections on anxiety carry meaningful implications for therapeutic practice. The goal is not to achieve a sanitized state of perpetual calm, but to learn how to live constructively with ambiguity. This approach requires what might be termed existential courage, the willingness to act purposefully even in the presence of unresolved fears and uncertain outcomes. Such courage does not eliminate fear, but ensures that fear does not eliminate action. In embracing this paradox, we may discover that accepting anxiety as an enduring part of life actually weakens its grip. By acknowledging it rather than resisting it, we regain the ability to live authentically. Attempts to suppress anxiety often only amplify its power, while learning to coexist with it can lead to a richer, more resilient engagement with life. Part 24, Hope and Despair, continued. Franz Kafka once remarked, perhaps most memorably, that while there is boundless hope in the universe, it does not extend to us. This observation encapsulates what Kafka saw as the core tragedy of human existence. Our ability to hope, which defines us as human, is also what causes us pain, because our hopes consistently reach beyond what the world is able to offer. We are beings who can dream of ideal realities while being confined within flawed ones. We envision justice even as we live under systems that deny it. We search for meaning in a cosmos that seems, at its core, indifferent or absurd. In this way, hope emerges as both our most profound strength and our deepest weakness. It grants us the power to imagine lives beyond our immediate condition, but also ensures a continual sense of discontent with the lives we actually lead. Kafka's characters exhibit various attempts to navigate this persistent tension between the reality they inhabit and the hope they cling to. Yet none of their approaches offer a fully satisfying resolution. For example, Joseph K., the protagonist of the trial, maintains a relentless belief in the possibility of justice and acquittal, long past the point when such faith appears rational. This unwavering hope keeps him moving forward, but also blinds him to the reality of his situation. It prevents him from adapting to the world as it is, or seeking fulfillment in places not dependent on the system's approval. In effect, his hope becomes a kind of trap, chaining him to illusions of control and obscuring chances for meaningful engagement in the here and now. By contrast, characters like Gregor Samsa in the Metamorphosis seem to surrender all hope following moments of profound upheaval. After his transformation, Gregor descends into quiet resignation, a state so devoid of agency that it renders purposeful action impossible. Though this despair may appear more honest than blind hope, it too is limiting. It shuts off the possibility of encountering unanticipated sources of resilience or meaning that could arise from actively facing one's circumstances. A total absence of hope is just as constraining as having too much of it. Without hope, the openness required for genuine experience vanishes. Despair imprisons just as effectively, convincing us that no improvement is possible and thereby ensuring we remain stuck in our current condition. In Kafka's worldview, both extremes, delusional optimism and absolute hopelessness, fail to represent an authentic engagement with the realities of human life. Fantastical hope diverts our focus from what is immediately present by anchoring us to imagined futures that may never materialize. Meanwhile, despair diverts us from the same present by persuading us that no effort can alter it. Both responses obscure the kind of grounded awareness necessary for authentic action. Action that acknowledges existing limitations without being entirely defined by them. By failing to engage fully with the present, both hope and despair, in their distorted forms, hinder our ability to uncover what meaning and agency still remain available. Kafka also draws attention to the way institutions exploit these emotional states, hope and despair, not merely on an individual level, but as tools of social control. Systems of power often maintain their dominance by strategically manipulating these deep human tendencies. One method is through the cultivation of false hope, promising eventual justice, prosperity, or vindication, and thereby keeping individuals invested in structures that do not truly serve their needs. These empty assurances distract people from the injustices they are experiencing now, blinding them to the limitations that urgently need confronting. Conversely, institutions may also engineer a sense of despair, encouraging the belief that no real change is possible, that resistance is futile. This kind of institutionalized pessimism leads people to accept their circumstances passively, as if submission were the only realistic path forward. The interplay of hope and despair also reflects broader dilemmas in how modern individuals experience time and possibility. Hope, by its nature, often involves anticipation, a focus on a future that may be untethered from any evidence found in the present or past. This orientation toward what might be can make us neglect what currently demands our attention and responsibility. It also leaves us deeply vulnerable when the future fails to align with our expectations. Despair, in contrast, operates with a reverse logic. It assumes that the future can only replicate the failures of the past. It forecloses the very idea of meaningful change, reducing life to a closed loop of repeated disappointments. Kafka's conception of hope draws a sharp line between genuine hope and the illusions of wishful thinking or denial. Real hope, in his view, demands an openness to the unknown and the unpredictable, while simultaneously embracing the constraints and ambiguities that define human existence. It is not anchored in specific goals or outcomes, nor does it offer certainty. Instead, it is rooted in a deep-seated confidence in the significance of human effort and engagement. This form of hope operates without assurances, driven by the belief that purposeful action remains meaningful even when its success is uncertain or unlikely. It is hope that endures in the absence of guarantees, animated by the conviction that striving itself holds intrinsic value. For Kafka, the interplay between hope and action is central. Hope that fails to inspire action risks becoming just another means of escape from reality. On the other hand, action pursued without any sense of hope or meaningful direction risks devolving into mere habit or compulsion, lacking authentic human intent. The challenge, then, is to cultivate just enough hope to initiate and sustain meaningful action, without falling prey to illusions that distort a clear view of reality. This delicate balance calls for what might be described as mature hope, a hope that remains steadfast in the face of uncertainty, aware of its own limitations, yet still committed to seeking out whatever genuine possibilities remain. Kafka's own literary work reveals the creative and expressive dimensions of such hope. His writing emerges as both a longing for communication and connection, and an acknowledgement that true understanding between individuals may ultimately be unreachable. Through writing, he expresses a hope that personal experience can be shared and that individual suffering might resonate with others and acquire broader meaning. At the same time, Kafka's lifelong difficulty in completing his major works, along with his request for their destruction after his death, reveals a sobering awareness. Even art, with all its expressive power, may fall short in bridging the profound isolation that separates one person from another. In this light, artistic creation becomes an act of hope carried out with the full knowledge that it may go unanswered. The philosophical weight of Kafka's reflections on hope and despair raises profound questions about how to live authentically when we lack certainty about whether our hopes are viable or our fears are valid. Living with integrity under such conditions requires learning to bear uncertainty and complexity, resisting the temptation of simplistic optimism or hardened cynicism. Rather than resolving the tension between hope and despair, Kafka invites us to inhabit that space creatively, to stay open to what is still possible, even while recognizing the constraints of our situation. This outlook might be best described as hopeful realism, a clear-eyed view of the world that does not obscure the truth, yet still affirms the value of action and commitment within the limits of what can be known and achieved. Part 25. Identity and Self-Knowledge. In Kafka's universe, the notion of personal identity becomes profoundly unstable as characters repeatedly find themselves unable to grasp who they truly are, what drives them, or what significance their lives might hold. This uncertainty isn't a temporary lapse that could be resolved through introspection or psychological insight. Rather, it points to a deeper, more unsettling question about whether a coherent and enduring self is even attainable or worth striving for. Kafka's characters often find themselves baffled by their own thoughts and actions. They are unable to predict how they will behave, and they frequently confront parts of themselves that feel foreign or unknowable. This internal estrangement undermines their ability to act with authenticity or form meaningful connections with others. The modern ideal that we can achieve self-understanding through reflection and analysis proves hollow in Kafka's world, leaving individuals unmoored in a vast sea of fragmented possibilities, with no reliable center to define who they are. The most vivid illustration of this existential instability comes through Gregor Samsa's transformation in the Metamorphosis. His sudden metamorphosis into an insect becomes a radical disruption of identity that defies explanation or control, both for himself and those around him. Although Gregor retains his memories and consciousness, suggesting a continued inner self, his inability to speak or engage with society marks a dramatic break in his human identity. This unsettling ambiguity raises fundamental questions. Is Gregor still the same person in a changed body, or has he become something entirely other? This tension between continuity and rupture in Gregor's identity encapsulates broader dilemmas about what truly constitutes the self. Is personal identity rooted in our physical form, in the continuity of memory and consciousness, in how others recognize and respond to us, or in some unstable combination of all these factors? Kafka leaves these questions open, pointing to the fragile and contingent nature of selfhood. Throughout Kafka's body of work, identity is shown to be largely shaped by social forces. While social identity is essential for functioning within a community, it can also obstruct personal growth and authenticity. Other people's perceptions, expectations, and assumptions exert a powerful influence over how individuals come to understand themselves, often in ways that are subconscious and involuntary. We tend to internalize these social scripts, becoming the versions of ourselves that others expect, simply because society demands predictability and order. This shaping of the self by external norms can offer a sense of stability and structure, but it also runs the risk of locking individuals into rigid roles that may no longer align with their evolving inner lives. As a result, individuals might find themselves unable or afraid to explore sides of themselves that fall outside socially sanctioned boundaries. Kafka also explores the rift between public identity and private experience, a divide that becomes a source of persistent tension and emotional strain. Characters must often perform versions of themselves that conform to social expectations, while privately wrestling with thoughts and feelings that diverge sharply from these external personas. This disconnect breeds a sense of inauthenticity and impedes genuine relationships. When individuals cannot be sure whether others are engaging with their true selves or merely with the social mask they wear, intimacy becomes fraught and elusive. In modern societies where people must juggle multiple and sometimes contradictory roles, the task of constructing a unified sense of self becomes even more complex. The result is often a fragmented identity, stitched together from conflicting obligations and expectations, leaving individuals with narratives that feel incomplete or incoherent. Kafka also examines how bureaucratic systems exert a quiet but profound influence on individual identity. In the trial, the legal apparatus slowly redefines Joseph K., transforming him from a self-assured professional into a disoriented and anxious defendant. The process doesn't merely alter his situation, it reshapes his very sense of self and his understanding of what he can do or become. This institutional control over identity works through classification, procedure, and language. Institutions assign people to categories, cases, types, problems, and process them accordingly. Over time, individuals may begin to accept these external definitions, perceiving themselves more through the lens of institutional logic than through personal agency or self-knowledge. The forces shaping identity extend into the economic sphere as well. Market-driven societies encourage individuals to present curated, commodified versions of themselves in order to secure employment, attract clients, or appeal to potential partners. In doing so, people may become alienated from aspects of themselves that hold no market value. The pressure to be sellable and efficient can erode the parts of the self that resist commodification, thereby narrowing the scope for authentic personal expression and development. The drive to cultivate marketable skills and socially appealing traits often comes at the cost of sidelining or suppressing aspects of ourselves that, while deeply meaningful on a personal level, hold little value in competitive economic systems. This external shaping of our identities can produce an internal division between the persona we present for professional gain and the more genuine self we may struggle to nurture, making holistic personal development increasingly difficult. The question of identity over time brings into focus whether our sense of personal continuity is genuine or simply a practical illusion used to make sense of experience. In Franz Kafka's work, characters frequently appear disconnected from who they once were and unsure of what they might become, creating a sense of dislocation that complicates long-term planning and commitment. Decisions made in the recent past may feel alien today, as if authored by someone else entirely. This fragmentation raises profound moral and philosophical questions about responsibility and accountability, questions that resist easy resolution. Such temporal discontinuity reflects a broader modern condition marked by rapid societal change and increased social mobility that renders older ideals of stable character and consistent personality increasingly obsolete. The pursuit of true self-knowledge becomes even more complex when we consider the possibility that there may be no singular, authentic self waiting to be unearthed beneath the roles we perform. Rather than discovering a fixed essence through introspection, we might instead be engaged in a continuous act of self-construction, responding and adapting to external forces that often lie beyond our control. Seeing identity as a process of becoming, rather than a stable core to be revealed, can evoke either a sense of liberation or existential dread. The responsibility of shaping ourselves without fixed rules or clear measures of success can foster persistent self-doubt and anxiety about whether we are heading in a meaningful direction. Kafka challenges the very premise of the self-knowledge ideal, suggesting that the belief in complete and coherent self-understanding may be flawed. Striving for total self-awareness might actually inhibit genuine engagement with life, stifling spontaneity and responsiveness to the present moment. Overanalyzing the self can devolve into a kind of paralysis, where reflection replaces action and introspection mimics insight without yielding it. Rather than seeking exhaustive self-understanding, the more attainable and perhaps healthier aim may be to cultivate enough self-acceptance to act authentically, even amidst lingering uncertainty about who we are or why we do what we do. The intersection of personal and cultural identity introduces further complexity, particularly for individuals navigating between divergent cultural spheres or conflicting value systems. Kafka's own life as a German-speaking Jew in Prague offered first-hand experience of the identity struggles that emerge from cultural marginality. Such liminal positions can foster internal conflict that resists resolution through simple affiliation or allegiance. Those who don't comfortably fit into conventional cultural categories often grapple with an enduring sense of dislocation, unsure where they truly belong or what guiding principles to follow. This cultural in-betweenness can serve as fertile ground for novel and creative identity formation, but it can also produce deep alienation and instability that make cohesive selfhood difficult to sustain. Kafka's philosophical approach to identity suggests that modern ideals of self-discovery and personal authenticity may need to be tempered by a recognition of uncertainty and fluidity as essential features of the human condition. Rather than aiming to uncover a definitive self, we might find greater meaning in learning to navigate and even embrace the continual evolution of who we are becoming. This perspective calls for a willingness to accept ambiguity and to withstand the discomfort that comes with acknowledging the limits of our self-control and foresight. The ultimate goal may not be the construction of a permanent identity, but the ongoing effort to live with integrity and authenticity amid the unpredictable, ever-changing landscape of human life.